Okay, welcome everybody. Let's start this complementary hearing. Welcome everybody at this group room. I welcome as well Eric Andrieux. Eric Andrieux over there is the chair of the Pest Committee, and he wanted to be with us today. So welcome, Eric. Glad that you are here. We organize as Greens, we organize this this complementary hearing not because we are protesting against the work of the Pest Committee. On the contrary, I, as co-rapporteur of the Pest Committee, together with Norbert Linz, I think we have a very good collaboration. We are working right now on writing the draft report, which will be presented the 27th of September. Of course, that draft report will not be the vision of the Greens, nor will it be the vision of the European Christian Democrats. It will be the common ground, the start of the political debate within the Pest Committee. So this complementary meeting is not criticising the work of the Pest Committee, although we feel that in the working together of political groups, we have, let's say, the more progressive groups and the more conservative groups, and from time to time there was a kind of, how do they say it in French, blocage between those two parts, and we felt that it was difficult from time to time to invite guests that we as Greens and probably also Socialists, Social Democrats and the European United Left wanted to invite. So that is why we thought that a complementary hearing would be useful for all those MEPs who will start working on the draft report, will table amendments, and we hope to gather today quite a lot of extra information that can be useful for the work of the Pest Committee. We start this complementary hearing with two keynote speakers, Robert Bobby Kennedy Jr. and Michael Baum, two attorneys who did win last August, 10th of August, the court case against Monsanto. They will explain how they do that, what information they used, what information they have from the Monsanto papers who are not disclosed yet, and they will give us an insight in how Monsanto tries to influence society and the political world. I agreed with both speakers that they will try to give their presentation in 30 minutes. Will be difficult because they have a lot of information, but I would insist on trying to indeed to be ready by 10:10 so that then we have enough time to start and to be able to give the floor to the distinguished guests, professors, scientists, who will bring in their knowledge into the issue. I don't know who will start. In the press conference it was Bobby who started. And he will do that again.
Yeah, I'll start again. Thank
you
very much, and thank you for having us. I'm going to try to speak briefly. If we do
That's
15 each?
15 minutes is half of...
Okay, yeah, I can do that math in my head. I just want to explain kind of how we got to where we are today with this issue, with the issue of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and Monsanto, because as many of you know, glyphosate and Roundup has been associated in the public mind and in the scientific literature with many, many injuries, with, for example, as a chelator of removing metals from people's bodies, of interfering with the human biome through the Shikami pathway and causing brain inflammation. It's been associated in various scientific papers with Alzheimer's, with obesity, with autism, with non-alcoholic fatty liver cancer, which is now affecting kids who are as little as 10 years old, with kidney cancer, with brain tumors, and with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and a litany or a parade of other injuries. We have in the United States, in our legal system, something called the Daubert standard, which is a standard where judges will not let a question get to a jury until, if it's a scientific question, they won't let the question get to the jury until it has passed certain standards of scientific reliability. And so none of those issues had enough scientific weight and volumes of scientific information to allow it to ever get past that gateway. When IARC in March of 2015 made its finding that glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen, particularly with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, it triggered a cascade of other findings by government agencies, including the California Environmental Protection Agency. And that activity created an inflection point where finally we were able to get through the gateway of the judge and get to a jury on non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Because of that, a group of attorneys got together and began informing the public through advertising. And we have today in the small group of attorneys, that we have about 8,000 cases of people who claim that they got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma because of exposure to glyphosate. So we tried the first case. Michael and I, Michael is the lead counsel, the lead attorney, the partner in the law firm, the lead law firm, Hedlund, that tried this case in California last month. We picked one of those cases and tried that as the first case, and we got a judgment of $289.3 million. The jury had two different judgments. One was a $40 million judgment for compensatory damages. That means the damages for the medical expenses of our client, Lee Johnson, and for pain and suffering that awarded him money for those injuries, to pay his expenses, to live on, and to compensate him for pain and suffering. In addition, the jury, we were able to show the jury some of the information you're about to see that showed that for 40 years, Monsanto had known that glyphosate was a probable, and Roundup were probable human carcinogens, and that they had been hiding actively and deliberately and purposefully hiding that information from the public. They were ghostwriting scientists, they were bribing scientists, they were capturing the agencies that are supposed to protect us from pollution in order to hide the science from the public. They were corrupting public officials and these kind of activities. And we were able to show that to the jury. And as a result of that, the jury made a separate finding, which was that Monsanto deserved punitive damages to punish it for its malevolent and oppressive behavior. And that's where the $250 million came from. So Monsanto now is facing another 8,000 of these same lawsuits, and Bayer is telling its shareholders, well, this is the worst one. Nobody else is going to give a verdict of that kind. This was a San Francisco jury. San Francisco is a very liberal town. And in fact, the jury we had was a highly educated jury. There were two scientists on it. The people took copious notes. They were very attentive. They had a long deliberation. And and it's possible that when we go out to farm country and try cases in St. Louis, which is Monsanto's hometown, that we're going to get less friendly juries. But on the other side, we had a judge in this case who was extremely, in her rulings, seemed to us to be overly friendly to Monsanto. So she consistently held on the side of Monsanto that we were not allowed to show evidence to the jury that we thought legally we ought to be able to show that jury. And in fact, about 80% of the documents that we intended to show the jury, the judge would not let us show. And we believe she committed judicial error when she made those findings. If we had lost the case, we would have appealed, and we believe we would have won that appeal based upon the fact that the jury didn't see evidence that it should have seen. And we believe that in future cases, we're going to be able to show that evidence to the jury and show other evidence to the jury as well. One thing that Europeans ought to understand is that in every American case, you get discovery. So we can file questions and demands for documents to the defendant, and they have to produce them. And that discovery does not end now. In every case, discovery is reopened, and we will be able to depose under oath prior to trial the officers and employees of Monsanto, and we will be able to make renewed demands for documents. So I think Monsanto really, Bayer has a headache here that aspirin is not going to cure. It's going to be a continuing headache for them as long as these cases continue. I want to say one last thing, which is that this case was personally gratifying to me. Monsanto has made its business model, kind of its core business strategy for many, many years, has been handling chemicals that other corporations, more responsible or more ethically based corporations, shun. Monsanto, I spent as an environmental lawyer almost 30 years of my life trying to get Monsanto's PCBs out of the Hudson River. I fought Monsanto on many other chemicals, on DDT, on Agent Orange, and other things. When I was a little boy, one of the high points of my life during the years when my uncle was in the White House was getting to meet my hero, Rachel Carson, which my uncle John Kennedy arranged, and she came to my house for dinner. At that time, she was dying of cancer. She had just published Silent Spring the year before, and she was under a vicious, sustained assault by Monsanto. Monsanto had hired teams of scientists that it had deployed to send around the country to say bad things about her. There were personal attacks. She was repeatedly called, because she was not married, she was called a spinster, which was a euphemism at that time for lesbian. She was accused of lying, of aggrandizing herself. She never defended herself because of her health. My uncle, I'm very happy to say, rose up to defend her. At that time, she was under attack. Monsanto had not only was mounting a direct assault, but it had hired a PR firm called Hill & Knowlton, which was at that time developing the strategy for the tobacco industry. And they used all the same methods that allowed the tobacco industry to escape regulation of a product for 60 years that was killing 1 out of every 5 of its customers who used that product as directed. They compromised scientists. They corrupted public officials. They did all of these. They bought in. They paid off third-party groups. For example, Monsanto paid off the American Medical Association, the American Garden Club, the Audubon Society to attack Rachel Carson. Even the United States Department of Agriculture, which was my uncle's department, was mounting an assault against her. And my uncle John Kennedy appointed a group of the most prestigious scientists in the country to go line by line through Silent Spring, and they validated every single essential factual assertion in that book, and they vindicated Rachel Carson. So I watched that happen as a little boy, and Monsanto's reputation preceded it, and I was so happy that I got to be part of this historic trial which once and for all brought Monsanto finally to justice in front of an American jury. And now I'm going to turn it over to Michael, and he's going to show you some of the documents that we did show the jury and also some of the documents that we were not allowed to show the jury, but we will in future trials.
Good morning. I'm Michael Baum. I'm one of the lawyers who was part of the trial team with my partner, Brent Wisner, who was the actual lead trial counsel. And we, as a team, leading up to this trial, acquired a lot of documents, many of which we declassified and published last year, and you know them probably as the Monsanto Papers. As part of the trial, we were able to release some additional documents, and we have more that are not declassified yet that relate in particular to Europe that we will be seeking declassification on soon. All of these documents are on my law firm's website, Baum Hedlund. That's BAUMHEDLUND. And if you did a Google search of Baum Hedlund and Monsanto Papers, you'll get to a site that has all of these documents that have been declassified so far, the documents that are part of this PowerPoint that I'm going to try to get through as much of as I can today, the opening and closing arguments from the trial, and this PowerPoint. So what I first want to impress upon the people here in Europe, and this is an opportunity, to express what my personal feeling is that I want to impress upon you to protect IARC. There are very few independent organizations like the International Association for Research on Cancer that rely on peer-reviewed published literature to arrive at conclusions, and that they use actual science, not spun corporate stuff that's actually probably more like marketing. These documents that I'm going to walk through and then you can have access to show how Monsanto's spin has affected the scientific debate regarding glyphosate and Roundup's carcinogenicity over the last 20 years or so. I brought with me some thumb drives for those of you who want them that have all these documents on it. So in case I don't get through everything, you can get a thumb drive and go through it then. Go to the next slide. What these documents show is that Monsanto has been engaging in a series of efforts to suppress science regarding the relationship of glyphosate or Roundup and carcinogenicity. In 1991, after some pretty sketchy animal studies had been used to get Roundup on the market, Monsanto pressured the U.S. EPA to place Roundup in Category E as not likely to be carcinogenic. Within a few years, some European studies, independent, non-corporate sponsored studies, found that there was DNA damage possibly being caused by Roundup. And so because Monsanto had conveyed to the U.S. and to the world that there was no carcinogenicity problem, there was no need to put it in the labeling, they had a problem. So next slide. And this is a 1998 internal memos and emails regarding a meeting that Monsanto had regarding those studies. And they were concerned that the papers by Leoy and Bolognese may present a big problem because these studies are with glyphosate and are on and they use standard endpoints. Up till then, Monsanto had fended off some of the studies that had been coming up and saying they'd used, different, incorrect or not reliable endpoints. So these studies did use reliable endpoints. Donna Farmer, in the email, a little excerpt from the email below, they held a meeting regarding the mutagenicity, the inclination of a chemical to cause DNA damage, in December of 1998. She was a chief toxicologist for Monsanto, and there she is saying it is a real concern that these papers may create an even bigger problem for us. Therefore, we need to do some things quickly. As EU has an immediate need and is a critical area now, it is agreed that, this is Mark Martins, would contact Dr. Perry next week to discuss with him his participation in the support of glyphosate-based formulations and genotoxic issues. What they're saying here is they wanted to hire Dr. James Perry to make these studies not seem so controversial and not look like they were a problem for Monsanto. So they hired him, and Dr. James Perry reviewed the studies, and this is the next slide. Dr. Farmer summarized his conclusions, and he essentially corroborated what those European independent scientists concluded. And this is the excerpts, and these are also all on these thumb drives are on the website. So what did they decide to do? Did they decide to go ahead and say, well, maybe these studies are valid and we need to warn people about the potential DNA damage? No. What they decided to do was bury it. And the next slide. Dr. Hayden's, who was Dr. Farmer's supervisor, said that they wanted to find someone who was comfortable with genotox profile and glyphosate Roundup, who can be influential with regulators and scientific outreach operations. That was why they hired Dr. Perry. They wanted someone who could go to EFSA or go to the EPA and explain away these studies. And it turned out that they'd spent some money on him, and they were regretting it, and they were hoping they hadn't spent too much money on him. And then Dr. Perry, in his conclusion, said, you need to do these studies to really nail down whether glyphosate or Roundup are safe. And they say here, we simply aren't going to do the studies Perry suggests. That's manipulation of science. That is suppressing science. They also decided that they were going to get someone else to convey the message to the regulators like EFSA and like the EPA, and that would be a stronger supporter for the industry than Dr. Perry appeared to be. Who did they hire? So next slide. They conveyed data and got an analysis done by Dr. Gary Williams and Dr. Robert Crows and Dr. Ian Monroe. And this study had a more favorable conclusion regarding glyphosate and Roundup's carcinogenicity based on those studies, and was cited for the last 20 years. And it was used to convey to regulatory agencies like EFSA and EPA that there's not a problem. They also did not convey, and they suppressed the three studies and analyses that Dr. Perry did. So they promoted this study, and they suppressed Dr. Perry's. And as it turned out, this next slide, when they were trying to deal with what they expected IARC was going to conclude about glyphosate and Roundup in 2015, they decided they wanted to collect up some experts to have an expert panel that would give them a more favorable spin than IARC gave them. And so they were going to collect up some epidemiologists and toxicologists and genotoxicologists and have them write up things that would be beneficial for fending off the IARC conclusions that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. And the thing that's revealing about this particular email, which is written in February of 2015, he reflects back on what they did back in 2000 when they had the problem with the European studies that showed DNA damage. We would be keeping the costs down by us doing the writing, and they would just edit and sign their names to speak. Recall that is how we handled Williams, Crowe, and Monroe in 2000. They ghost wrote the Williams-Monroe study. Instead of publishing Dr. Perry's results, they had a study that whitewashed the problem, and they ghost wrote it. That's how science got manipulated. That's how it got the safety and labeling of Roundup was manipulated here in Europe and around the world by using ghostwriting techniques like this. Next slide. So, in March of 2015, IARC did conclude that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. And this was not news to Monsanto. They had known and had been fending it off for years. They had a couple of programs. One was called Let Nothing Go. Another one was called Freedom to Operate. And another one, they refer to it as whack-a-mole, the child's game where you, at a arcade where you whack moles down with a hammer. They keep popping up. They had been playing whack-a-mole with independent science for years. So next slide. So one of the things that they did was they focused on studies that just looked at the parts, not the formulations of Roundup. So the regulatory agencies required analyses of glyphosate alone, or the formulation of the surfactant alone, or other allegedly inert chemicals in Roundup. And what they didn't do was do a study of all of them together to show the synergistic effect. And so here's Donna Farmer again, their chief toxicologist, in August of 1999. And she's saying, I will not support doing any studies on glyphosate, formulations, or other surfactant ingredients at this time with the limited information we have on the situation. This is particularly important for Europe because over time, France and Germany were extremely concerned about the surfactant toluamines, the POEA, that was considered by itself to be a dangerous chemical. And so they wanted to have that chemical not part of the products that were being used in Europe. What Donna Farmer and the scientists at Monsanto knew was that they had not actually tested the formulation of the glyphosate plus the surfactant on long-term carcinogenicity studies. So next slide.
5 minutes to go.
Okay. So here is an internal memo from December of 1999 when they're remarking on European concern regarding the surfactant that was added to glyphosate to help it be more penetrable, and it caused it to penetrate the surface of plants and also to penetrate the surface of skin as well. So it's made it so that the glyphosate itself could be more easily delivered and harmful to either plants or humans or the microbiome in the human gut. Next slide. Mark Martins, who is the Monsanto's Director of Toxicology for Europe and Africa, also chimed in and said if somebody came to me and said they wanted to test Roundup, I know how I would react with serious concern. We have to really think about doing formulations even if they are not on the market. Here, there was a discussion again of someone saying maybe we should test formulations. They did not want formulations studied for long-term carcinogenicity because they did not want the results. They did not want to see the results. Next slide. And even years later, in 2009, Donna Farmer was saying, you cannot say that Roundup does not cause cancer. We have not done carcinogenicity studies with Roundup. Next slide. In 2010, Monsanto's Richard Garnett of the Global Crop Protection Regulatory Affairs Strategy lead for Monsanto Europe, and Bill Hayden's were discussing again what to do about studies of formulations. If you start at the bottom with the January 25th, 2010 email, that says, anyway, there are non-hazardous formulations, so why sell a hazardous one? That's a pretty telling little email. Despite the debate about the dangers of the POEA and taloamines, they knew they had a non-hazardous formulation they could use, but they wanted to protect their market. So look up at the email above. And there's still a strong sentiment in St. Louis that we need to continue to defend taloamines, even though we prepare to switch over because of their impending demise. Reasons to do so: domino effect on other taloamines. Defend other world areas to the best of our ability. Second, I was in Brazil all last week. They are very worried about this coming across the Atlantic to their part of the American hemisphere. So they were going to continue to use the dangerous POEA taloamine that was being banned in Europe in order to protect their market in other places. They were continuing to defend it here. So in 2010, they had a strategy meeting of what to do about Germany wanting to ban it, POEAs there. And what was their solution? Push back on data requests and defend the POEAs, notwithstanding that they knew that they had a safer alternative. Next slide. And one of their concerns with respect to the French ANSIs was that when they were withdrawing the POEAs, they wanted it just be because they wanted it to be the precautionary principle. They didn't want it to be seen that there was a health problem. So here we are expecting the letter of intention from French regulator ANSIs very soon, and it might point to imminent health risks regarding the use of taloamine. They wanted to manipulate and prevent France from saying that there was a health concern. They wanted it to just be, oh, we were just being precautionary. Oh, all right. So I'm just going to flip through some of the rest of this. Yeah. Next slide. So they had a program of whack-a-mole that they organized attacking or preventing non-industry publications. And you may have all heard about it, Professor Seralini, who had published a study showing carcinogenicity. Again, they went to attacking him. They orchestrated the attack. All the negative things you may have heard about that carcinogenicity study were manufactured and generated and orchestrated by Monsanto. They created the letters to the editor. They had the editor who was on their payroll, and they pressured him to retract that study. The study did what Monsanto had refused to do. They had done a diet study for 13 weeks on rats, which basically gets them through being teenagers, and not through their lifetime. What Seralini did was did the entire lifetime. And when you do the entire lifetime of exposure to Roundup in their diet, it showed a high level of carcinogenicity. So I have a whole bunch more to talk to you about, and there's a bunch of documents, and I'm happy to meet with you afterwards. You can get access to all these documents and the trial testimony and all the exhibits that we used in the trial to get the $289 million dollar verdict. They're on my website. They're in these thumb drives if you'd like. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks. In the meantime, I invite Martin Dermine to come to, and maybe also Professors Lies and Zaller to already come to. And in the meantime, we can take one or two questions. Il y a des questions? Un ou deux? Yes. You say who you are, yeah.
Oui, Guillaume Ballas, je suis eurodéputé français. J'avais une question juridique.
Wait, we have to.
Okay, just
so it's English.
one juridical question.
Wait.
Est-ce que the fusion between Monsanto and Bayer could be a problem for you, for your work in United States for the next dossier?
I don't think it has any effect. I don't think it'll have any effect on what we do in the U.S. We have the documents and the clients ready to go to trial, and we're only expecting that they will be funded by Bayer as opposed to Monsanto when they have their trial team. They may switch teams. They may change their approach or their style, may change their experts. I don't know what they're going to do because they committed themselves to a story that we essentially decimated. They took their experts apart. And by using peer-reviewed actual science, using the International Agency for Research on Cancer's analyses and the studies that they relied upon, and these internal documents, they show that they knew for a long time they had a problem with Roundup's carcinogenicity, and they covered it up.
We were able to listen to the shareholders meeting, the telephone call that Werner Bowman, who is the CEO of Bayer, had with his largest shareholders, where he was reassuring them after our verdict. And it was almost baffling, some of the things he said, because it showed a very little understanding for the science that we were able to bring in front of the jury, and for the fact that this was a unanimous jury verdict. It was a unanimous jury verdict in front of a judge who was hostile to us, that excluded 80% of our evidence, and it was a jury verdict that was based largely upon the bad behavior of Monsanto. And Bowman seemed to not understand any of that. So it's going to be interesting to us to see what Bayer brings to this fight. But we're not worried about it. We have a lot of strong cases, and the science is getting stronger and stronger. And the fact that we won that case, even with having so little, being able to show such a small percentage of that evidence, about 20% of the evidence to the jury, makes us very confident that in future trials we are gonna, we're gonna do very well.
Eric?
Oui, merci Marc. D'abord, merci, comme tu l'as évoqué tout à l'heure, Éric Andrieux, donc je suis le président de la commission PEST, donc ici au sein du Parlement européen. Merci d'abord au groupe des Verts d'avoir organisé cette rencontre. Elle est en complément, et tu l'as dit excellemment, dans des travaux que nous pouvons conduire. Voilà, le rythme de la démocratie est ainsi fait, donc certains groupes politiques peuvent se permettre d'aller au-delà et à l'audition de votre exposé, je crois que cette audition va être complémentaire et il va jouer un rôle important. Parce que même si effectivement la législation ou le droit n'est pas transférable de continent à un autre continent, le travail que vous conduisez donc peut et va nous aider, sans nul doute, donc dans nos travaux. Et dans ce que vous évoquez, ce qui me paraît le plus important, parce que nous, notre enjeu à nous, c'est pas, bien sûr, c'est en tant que citoyen d'observer le procès de Monsanto, donc en tant qu'élu également, mais en tant que législateur, c'est effectivement donc de voir comment, à l'échelle européenne, on peut vraiment modifier le protocole d'autorisation des molécules, de telle sorte que nous garantissions finalement aux citoyens européens que ceux qui consomment donc ou ceux qui respirent donc est exempt de dangerosité. Et une des questions majeures que l'on se pose dans nos travaux, et je parle sous contrôle du rapporteur, d'un des rapporteurs, c'est effectivement la question des conflits d'intérêts. Et donc là, ce que vous évoquez, ce que vous dites, donc, ce qui me paraît essentiel dans le procès, c'est effectivement ce lien-là qui est toujours ténu et très complexe à appréhender entre finalement l'industrie et le poids de l'industrie, la force de l'industrie et le monde de la science et de l'expertise. Et qu'effectivement, donc, c'est un sujet qui est au cœur c'est le premier sujet d'ailleurs que l'on va appréhender dans le rapport, c'est comment dans le protocole, si vous voulez, on a la garantie. L'histoire, il y a hier, il y a aujourd'hui finalement, puis il y a demain. Et nous, ce qui nous importe aujourd'hui, c'est comment demain, à la lecture de ce qui s'est passé, de ce qui se passe aujourd'hui, on peut vraiment donner des garanties, donc aux 500 millions d'Européens, réels en tant que législateurs. Et la question que je voulais vous poser, c'est comment vous considérez l'appel qu'a fait Monsanto, et est-ce que vous avez espoir que sur l'appel, donc le jugement qui a eu lieu puisse perdurer?
Oui.
There's a couple of things. Let me start by responding, and then I'll let Michael talk about the appeal. But let me just respond to what you said about protecting the public welfare. In the United States, many of the states within the United States are responding to this lawsuit by taking precautions. And one of the things that they're doing is saying, look, we're going to continue to allow the agricultural application of Roundup, but in places where school children are exposed, like on public property, in public buildings and schools, we're going to ban it on playing fields, these kind of things. And also, some of them are considering the illegalization of the use of Roundup as a desiccant. So Roundup until 2006 was used as a conventional weed killer. It was sprayed on weeds or on fields to kill the weeds. But in 2006, Monsanto began marketing an off-label use, which is they told farmers, look, it happens that this chemical is very good at drying out your crops before you harvest them. So you spray it on them in the field, and they dry out nicely, and they're easier to remove from the field. And it's true. But for the first time, farmers in a large scale began spraying glyphosate onto food, directly onto the food we eat. And today, that's one of the problems. The amount of the usage expanded by about 75%. And today, it's everywhere. It's in our children's breakfast cereals. It's in our snacks. It's in wine. It's in beer. It's in our groundwater. It's in the air. It's in everything. And part of the reason is this expanded use, which is unnecessary for farming. And it's one of the areas that this could be limited until we know more about whether it makes sense to use Roundup at all.
Michael?
So was your question how long is the appeal going to take? Or what we think? So let me just say, because our client has terminal cancer and may die soon, we're going to have an expedited appeal process. So we are hoping to get it done as quickly as possible. I think any fair group of appellate judges will rule in our favor. The documentation and the experts that we have were excellent. The documents showing that, I mean, there are documents where their reaction to the IARC finding was and being adopted in California was to say that Californians, they're being overrun in California by liberals and morons like a zombie movie, and they need to be taken out one by one. That was their attitude. Their attitude was not to warn people, to take care of the problem. They viewed it that they needed to eradicate the people who found that there was a problem with the carcinogenicity. That's just wrong. And hopefully Bayer will step in and, maybe set the company straight and, recognize that these documents and the internal studies that they did and suppressed need to be exposed and shown to people and regulators, and that people will get the protection they need from the regulators and legislators like you.
Okay, thanks. We go to, I could take 1-2 questions, and the keynote speakers stay with us. So if you have questions to them, they stay with us. They will leave now the room for a few minutes because there is a television interview with Deutsche Welle.
Okay.
But they come back and they are with us. They stay with us till 1 o'clock. So if you have questions to them, no problem. We go to the next part of this hearing with Martin Dermine. I invite as well the Noah Simon Delso and the 2 professors to come to the and then we can continue. Martin, vous allez présenter nous, or you will present us a review of the new publication that within a few weeks or days will be presented to the European audience. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Bart Stas. Thank you to the organizers for organizing this event and also for inviting Pan-Europe. We are the only European NGOs working exclusively on pesticides, and we regret that we were never invited by the Pest Committee. So thank you for giving us the possibility to express ourselves. So Pan-Europe is working to reduce the use of pesticides across Europe and have them replaced by environmental friendly alternatives. I'm going to speak about the necessary review of the pesticide regulatory process. There are several processes happening in parallel in the European Union. So the pesticide legislation is composed of several legislations. The first one is the plant protection products, so pesticide regulation. It clearly mentions that priority must be given to human health, animal health, and the environment. That a high level of protection is mandatory. That it is underpinned by the precautionary principle. And in our view, we do not reach these goals currently. Then the next regulation is, you can go backwards, thanks, the maximum residue limit of pesticides residues we can find in food and feed. Again, it mentions a high level of protection to human health and the environment, and among others, mentions the fact that the combined exposure, so every day we are exposed to tens or dozens of pesticides, especially in the food we eat, but there is no assessment of this combined exposure, and this has to change. And finally, the directive on the sustainable use of pesticides, which clearly mentions that pesticides have to be used as a last resort. Angeliki, next, please. That integrated pest management, so the use of pesticide after using alternatives in agriculture, is mandatory already for more than 4 years, but what we observe in the fields is that it is not the case. That member states shall provide independent information on alternatives to pesticides to their farmers. This is also very much lacking in the EU. And that the use of pesticides in sensitive areas like schools or hospitals must be avoided. In some member states like Belgium, it is very much advanced. You cannot use pesticides in public areas anymore in Belgium, but in others there is nearly no regulation, and this has to be improved. So there are different review processes in parallel in the EU this year, since last year. It is very exciting for us. First, there is the refit, so the fitness check of the plant protection products and the MRL regulations. This is carried out by DG Santé with a consultant. Then the research service of the European Parliament has made an evaluation of the implementation of the PPP regulation. There was also an evaluation by the Environment Committee of the European Parliament. And the scientific advice mechanism of the European Commission, so the SAM that gives advice directly to the European Commission, has evaluated the authorization process for pesticides. And another process that is undergoing, but for which we don't have any results for the moment, is, of course, the work from the Pest Committee that I will not mention because we don't have any outcome for the moment. So the refit, I was saying it is part of the better regulation from the Commission in order to evaluate if the European legislation is fit for purpose. The European Commission decided not to evaluate the directive on the sustainable use of pesticides, and this is, in our view, a really big problem because it is the only legislation that aims at reducing the use of pesticides and the exposure to pesticides. We complained about it to the Commission, but there was no way to include it in the process, and they had no correct justification to explain why it is not part of the process. Next, please. The Commission has written 53 questions and sub-questions that the consultant has to answer, and according to our analysis, these questions are strongly biased towards business and trade interests, and a very small amount of questions are linked to human health and the environment. So we made a quick and dirty analysis of these 53 questions, and as you can see on this graph, 46% of the questions are oriented to help business, trade, conventional farmers. Only 11% of the questions are linked to human health and the environment, and the rest are either mixed questions or questions that have nothing to do with these topics. And we consider that when you read the pesticide regulations, all the recitals, it is clearly written that the first aim of the regulation is to protect human health and the environment. And in our view, this refit process is a scandal in the way that only 11% of the questions are dedicated to the first aim of the regulation. Then we also regret that the work carried out by the consultant is not so much an investigative work to find proofs that the regulation is correctly implemented, but it is rather a compilation of opinions from stakeholders. They made consultations, we had interviews with them, and from the preliminary results that were provided to us, we can see that there is no clear guidelines and advice given by the consultant to improve the implementation, to show where there are problems in the implementation, what has to be improved, and they also give a big focus on the administrative and financial burden for the pesticide industry. As I was saying, it's a compilation of opinions. There are some interesting elements, but that we already know. For instance, they made an open public consultation in which they indicate that 91% of the responses say that the use of pesticide does not minimize the impact on the environment. This we already know. A lot of polls indicate that citizens are concerned by the use of pesticides, by their exposure to pesticides, by their impact on the environment, and we clearly want in the future the European Commission to understand that they have to go in the direction of a stricter regulation of pesticides. Then the work from the Environment Committee, they worked on the implementation of the pesticide regulation, and among the main findings they made, we had an increase on the number of derogations. So member states give exceptional authorizations, temporary authorizations to their farmers to use non-authorized pesticides that have not been evaluated for the harm they can cause on human health, animal health, or the environment. And there is no justification for that, so there is clearly an abuse, and the Commission, in our view, is not reacting at all to this inflation in the amount of derogations. Then the cutoff criteria, which is a system to automatically ban pesticides that are carcinogenic, toxic to reproduction, mutagenic, or endocrine disruptors, is not implemented. In all these years, only one pesticide was banned based on the cutoff criteria, despite of the fact that many others are meeting these cutoff criteria. Then they indicate that integrated pest management, which is a key tool to reduce farmers' dependency on pesticides, and the use of low-risk substances are not promoted in a sufficient way at EU level. and that the pesticide regulation is not in line with other policies. Policy on climate change to have a more environmental friendly agriculture, for instance, or is not, even though it is mentioned in the regulation, the link with the sustainable use of pesticide to reduce the use of pesticide is not made. So many efforts are needed at EU and member states level to correctly implement the pesticide regulation. Then the work carried out by the European Parliament Research Service, in our view, is of much better quality than what is being done in the frame of the refit by the European Commission. They have relied on 4 studies carried out by consultants that have much more room of maneuver to carry out their research in a much more independent way. Among their main findings, again, you have the integrated pest management that is not addressed by the pesticide regulation. Then the fact that the scientific evidence that leads to pesticide industry is produced by that leads to the authorization of pesticides is produced by the pesticide industry. There is a clear conflict of interest. The competent authorities, the public servants at member states level are understaffed, and the quality of their output is a very highly variable quality. This is a major issue. Some member states are much more industry friendly in the way they regulate pesticides. Again, the misuse of emergency authorization, a lack of transparency in the decision-making process. When member states at political level starts discussing if they agree to authorize, reauthorize, ban a pesticides, this is completely obscure and we don't have any information made publicly available. In many member states, citizens do not even have, cannot even have the position of their member state on a pesticide authorization. And the final process that is underway is the work of the scientific advice mechanism that was published a few months ago. They have very much worked on the fact that there is a dual system of evaluation and authorization at EU level. The active substance, for instance, glyphosate, is assessed at EU level with the help of member states, and then the formulation, the several hundreds of formulations have to be assessed at national level by each national authority. Again, this creates a lot of difference in the approach, in the quality of the assessment at national level, and their advice is to merge all the evaluations in only one EU agency in order to have a high level evaluation of the risk posed by pesticides, and also the authorization process should take place at least in part at EU level. In our view, the work from the SAM is quite good, but we have a big problem with the fact that they use a biased initial postulate that pesticides are necessary for agricultural production. We have nearly every month, a publication showing that it is possible to feed the world without pesticides. The majority of farmers around the globe do not use pesticides, and that it is a myth that pesticides are necessary to feed the world. But this myth, we often hear it even in EU institutions and in the Commission especially. It is the SAM advise us to launch a public debate on the form of agriculture we want in the EU in order to stop all these debates we constantly have on the risk posed by pesticides. I think it would be good to ask our citizens what kind of agriculture they want, and then once for all decide if we go towards a more environmental and human-friendly way of producing food, or if we keep in this industrial way of producing food that in our view makes no sense. They also mentioned that any pesticide can have a negative impact on human health. I think this is very important, and that in the end it is nearly impossible to meet the objective of the regulation that pesticides must not have any impact on human health. They also, as I said, say that the entire evaluation and authorization process has to be done in a single EU agency. they recommend, in order to compensate for the weaknesses of the process, to carry out systematic post-market vigilance and correct the authorization if they see that pesticides have an impact on the environment, that any regulatory study, even if it's not conducted to the end, has to be registered and the result made public. And also they propose a very interesting way of doing assessment with comparative assessment, and any new pesticide or older pesticide that is more toxic than others should not be authorized or should be banned, because we have to systematically reduce the toxicity of the pesticides that are used. So at PAN we thought that a lot of very good and interesting information is already available, but several aspects of the debate were not taken into account. We also think it is important to know what citizens want, and so we have created a group called Citizens for Science in Pesticide Regulation. It is a group of more or less 20 NGO experts in the field of pesticides, academia experts, lawyers, who have worked on a document that will be published in a few weeks on the necessary reform of the pesticide risk assessment. Our aim is to come and complement all the work that has already been carried out. Among the different topics we have worked on is the fact that, and this is not mentioned yet because, and there I think the work done by our American colleagues is very important, is the fact that most of the regulators you speak with are still completely confident in the fact that the pesticide industry is completely honest, that they do not manipulate science, that they provide us all the information they have. But what has been done in the US on glyphosate and Monsanto clearly shows that they should not be allowed to carry out themselves the tests that lead to the authorization of their products. There is a complete conflict of interest. So all the tests, the glyphosates should be given, for instance, to EFSA with money, and EFSA should carry out the entire process of assessing it in independent contract labs and evaluating the results, and of course the results should be made publicly available. There is nothing that prevents this system to be put in place. Only mentalities need to be changed in EFSA, in the European Commission, and I can tell you that they always answer us the same: this is impossible to do. With money you can do anything you want, and it is completely possible to do this. Next, please. Then a lot of many experts that carry out the evaluation of the toxicity of the pesticides and the authorizations, less in the European institutions but much more at member state levels, have ties with the industry. Sometimes they work for the industry as consultants, but they still do the review and work at EU level and national level, and we consider that a very much stricter conflict of interest policy with very strict punishments for the people who do not respect the rules should be put in place. Then the test methods that are used to carry out the tests, the toxicity tests, are sometimes very old. Very often they have been in part co-written by the pesticide industry, by scientists that have ties with the pesticide industry. So we need strong conflict of interest policies in designing test methods. And we also ask that all the current test methods should be reviewed by independent scientists that are experts in the field. We also believe, and this has been published by other NGOs and by us, that in some panels working for EFSA, nearly half of the scientists have ties with the pesticide industry, and we need EFSA to to stop their relation with these people and finally work with actively publishing experts. This is not the case for the moment, or very little, and to give them a correct compensation either for them or for the institution they work for, so that they can work for EFSA. And as a last point I wanted to mention is that very often in the risk assessment, non-industry studies are discarded. This was very much discussed about glyphosate. Nearly all studies were discarded. But on the other hand, sometimes EFSA or member states make use of independent studies. In the case of neonicotinoids, independent studies were very much used by EFSA, despite of the fact that they didn't have this GLP, Good Laboratory Practices certificate. They were used by EFSA. EFSA has produced very interesting output. And there is no reason that for neonicotinoids they use independent science, and this leads to a ban on neonicotinoids. But for glyphosate they discard independent science, and this leads to maintenance of this chemical that has been classified carcinogenic on the market. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Martin. We go now to the first part of the hearing, which will deal with the environmental impacts of pesticides. We have three people on the panel, and we start with Dr. Noah Simon Delso. You are also on the hearing tomorrow of the PEST committee. We agreed that you would deal with another part of your expertise today, and so tomorrow we will hear the second part. I give you the floor, but I can say this meeting is web streamed, and I got a message that a few hundred people are following this conference at this time. So we are with more than here in this room listening to the experts. Noah.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, so indeed today I am going to focus my presentation more on what we call the worldwide integrated assessment of the impact of systemic pesticides. There we include neonicotinoids and fipronil on biodiversity and ecosystem services. I'm going to explain you a little bit the background of why we, a group of independent researchers, started this assessment, which has been published, and then everything is available. This worldwide integrated assessment is the first meta-analysis of the impact of neonicotinoids and fipronil on the environment. It has been followed by other publications, like, for instance, the EASAC or some other publications. And there have been several publications, as I said, and in the presentation I included, you have all the links, so if it's circulated, well, everybody have access to the documents. It has been created by 29 independent scientists from very, very various disciplines. I participated from the bee pollinator perspective, but there are water experts, soil experts, bird experts, really very various. And we come from different continents. So here, for those of you who are interested in all the publications, so you have here all of them. There were a first set of publications in 2014 and 2015. In that one, we started from the trends and uses and the mode of action of neonicotinoids and their metabolites, just to understand the physicochemical activity characteristics, because actually it is very important to understand this part and the mode of action to understand what are the effects that eventually we could have in the environment. And then we separated the knowledge between the impacts of invertebrates, the impacts on vertebrates, the impact on ecosystem services, and of course, since it is always criticized that, okay, you are bringing here a lot of information about the fate and the impact of products, but there are no alternatives. So we also produced publications reviewing all the alternatives that are that were in 2015 in the market already in use to avoid the use of neonicotinoids and fipronil. And a second set of publications was published last year, where we update the knowledge, because you need to know that neonicotinoids have been some of the best studied pesticides ever. And I mean, the amount of publications that exist on either on the fate of the fate, so where we can find these products in the environment, or the impact on different species, even on us humans, it's really, really colossal. And then so last year there were 3 more publications, and one of them very, very thorough on the alternatives. And the only publication that is missing from the second part are the conclusions and the regulatory issues. So just to get a little bit of, so in this, the methodology that we used, because this has always been very, very criticized, so we wanted to do a synthesis of all knowledge available, either in independent science, or even included grey science or science produced by industry. So we really took everything, all kind of information that was available, and we included it in this review. And then we put it together and we made a sense out of it. And I can tell you that as a scientist participating to this, it has been very, very hard for us to do this work, because it is so the scientists that actually are critical to whatever thing that costs a lot of money and produces a lot of money are on the target, and actually our criticized is always questioned, and it is really so we are under a lot of pressure, and even though we try to do the best work that we can do. So thank you. So all these publications are a result of a very, very large literature review, over 1,000, even 2,000 papers. And the main findings are, that there is a clear evidence of the harm to actually trigger regulatory action. That was already the outcome on the publications of 2014-15. Then, luckily, like in 2013, we had the first set of partial suspensions, and luckily we got farther this year, but still we didn't remove them from the market, so they are still authorized. So neonicotinoids are persistent and accumulate in the environment. They are water-soluble and systemic. They are very, very efficient, which means that they are very toxic, and this toxicity increases with the duration of the exposure, and the effects that have been described. And I'm a bee expert, so I'm going to explain you a little bit more what is the part on bees. They go from acute to chronic effects, from lethal to sublethal. It's really a very, very wide amount of effects that have been described so far. And then, so what we did because we had all these different disciplines in the group, we separated, and so we actually triggered different taxonomic groups and different species, and then we saw that there are actually effects that are observed at very, very low concentrations in non-target species. So this is an infograph. If you don't want to read all the publications that have been produced, because it is time-consuming. It's very good, but it is time-consuming. So we created a very nice, I must say, infographic that actually summarizes the work. So here what you have, it's on the top is the taxonomic groups. So we divide it in microbes, insect pollinators, terrestrial invertebrates, aquatic invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, fish, birds, and mammals. In the second line, you have the exposure. So what is the way that these different taxonomic groups can get exposed to neonicotinoids? So there you have through the plants, through the air, through the water, through the soil. And of course, depending on the biology of the different taxonomic groups, that depends. In the case of bees, you have, so it's the second column, they are very much exposed through plants. They are very much exposed through the air. They are exposed through water, and they are exposed through soil. Soil is less for instance, honeybees, but it is very relevant, for instance, for bees that nidified in the soil. On the third column, you have the ecotoxicological effect that has been described by all these publications, and there you have a P that is probable, and then you have different circles. So the more circles you have, you see, means that publications, scientific literature, it has been shown that the effects, toxicological effects, have been described at lower doses. Yeah. So, for instance, for insect pollinators, you have at individual level, you have 4 circles. That means that they are extremely toxic at very low concentrations. Yeah. The same has been described for populations, and then we also separate it for communities. But this is nitty-gritty details. And then finally, on the latest line, you find the ecosystem services. So each of these taxonomic groups provide to us an ecosystem service. And then, so there for the different taxonomic groups, we identified which would be the ecosystem services that would be at risk, or that are at risk because of the exposure to neonicotinoids and fipronil. So it was the best we could do to actually summarize the huge amount of data that is existing out there. Thank you. So this is just an example of microbes. But you can pass to the second one. So it's, so please, on insects. Here I included, because, sorry, it is my field of expertise, it's the insect pollinators. So as I said, okay, exposure through plants, through the air, through water, and a little bit through soil. And then for the ecotoxicological, so they, as you know, they participate to pollination services and to food web support. They, and then as from the ecotoxicological effects, what we have observed, or what science has observed, is that there are lethal effects, so the acute toxicity, and very often it is said, but if we remove neonicotinoids from the market, we are going to replace them with more toxic substances. Well, there is no more toxic substances than neonicotinoids in the market. There are other products that have a similar toxicity, but different physicochemical characteristics, so yeah. Then what we observe on honeybees is a delayed toxicity, which is actually not very obvious. That means that the bees get exposed at one point in time, and we will only see the effects 2 months after, or 3 months after, or 4 months after. Of course, this is not obvious to say what caused the effects. And this is one of the difficulties that we have in the field to actually verify if there have been exposure or an intoxication with a neonicotinoid. The chronic toxicity has been described at even lower doses at the acute toxicity, and then this only happens when we prolong the exposure in time. And something that is very typical from neonicotinoids is this atypical dose-effect relationship. One would think, okay, if we are exposed to very little doses, I have no problem. And if I am exposed to very high doses, I am at big risk of having a problem. Well, actually, what has been observed for neonicotinoids is that there is a high toxicity at very low concentrations. Then this toxicity reduces when the concentration increases, and then the toxicity re-increases when the concentrations of exposure are very high. So the fact of being exposed to very, very diluted concentrations does not save you from having an effect. No, not you, but that does not save the bees or the insects to having an effect. And then finally, we have observed synergistic effects with other pesticides. It is very, very well known, and it is even patented by industry, that actually when we put together a neonicotinoid and a fungicide or something else, or another insecticide, we get a much higher effect than when we get the products separately. Okay, so we have also observed a big variety of sublethal effects. That means that the bees do not die after the exposure, but there is a problem. They have been from behavioral modifications in learning, memory, or the response to a stimuli, recognition of stimuli, morphological modifications, physiological modifications, a big problem on reproduction. So a lot of the beekeepers are complaining that their queens are not lasting as they used to do. Well, actually, we know more and more that neonicotinoids affect both the queen and the males, so the sperm of the males, and this, of course, affects all the production of the colonies. And then, of course, since they are neurotoxic, they create problems in the activity, locomotion, and the homing flight. So the bees do not go back to the colonies after foraging. And finally, and this is increasingly, so we know a lot, but increasingly there are more and more studies, are the interactions of neonicotinoids with pathogens or parasites that actually make the bees much more sensitive to any disease. And what we observe for honeybees, because honeybees are the best well-studied models, I mean, because it serves as a model species. So now we also get more and more studies on bumblebees and solitary bees, and we observe exactly the same, but just at different doses. So the effects continue being the same. From the lethal point of view, from the sublethal point of view, we also observe delayed at hatching, problems in reproduction, development of nest growth, etc. So it's exactly the same, but just at different doses. So this exercise has been done for all of them. So here you pass because it's like I just did okay. So it's amphibians, reptiles, fish, and everything. So each of the publications that we did include all these analyses. And so the big effort in literature review actually allow us to to identify a lot of gaps that you have here, and then there are a lot of gaps in exposure. It is very, very hard actually to see studies on getting data on how much residues of neonicotinoids are out there, and mainly on their metabolites. And about the toxicity, there is a big, I mean, now there is increasing data on that, but there is still a lot to be known on what is the impact, for instance, on soil organisms, on marine systems, or on other vertebrates, just to cut it short. So as our conclusions already after the first evaluation, but we continue, is that the present scale of use was just not sustainable, and that the alternatives are there and are economically viable. And then if we continue using these products in the same level, we will just finish with our environment. So I mean, just to finalize, regarding the regulatory context, as Martin was saying, so the neonicotinoids got into the market already before the Europeization of the authorization. So it was before, it was at national level, and they were included in different countries. Then there was they passed through the directive, and of course a risk assessment was carried out. But this risk assessment, the methodology for the bees, in order to evaluate the impact on neonicotinoids on bees, was extremely deficient. So normally, when in 2012 there were some publications that showed that actually neonicotinoids were created unacceptable effects on bees. And following these studies, and in parallel, actually, the EFSA has been working on an improvement on the methodology for risk assessment. So this combination actually did that today we have the outcome, and I would say in the case of the neonicotinoids, I must say that the EFSA did a very good, thorough work, and a very good outcome, I think. But the whole process was different regarding glyphosate. So neonicotinoids, in the process, let's say, we improved the methodology for risk assessment, at the same time that we improved the methodology to risk assessment to equalize the level of scientific knowledge. Yeah? We had scientific publications that showed that the approval criteria were not anymore met, and then that launched the whole process of re-evaluation. So the process and the amount of independent data that we have and the EFSA have evaluated about neonicotinoids, I would say it's unprecedented vis-à-vis the other molecules and vis-à-vis what is done on a normal basis when we do a reauthorization process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for this valuable input. We continue with Professor Matthias Lies. He's from the, and I have to read it out, the Helmholtz Zentrum für Umweltforschung from Leipzig. You're an expert on the impact of insecticides, on pesticides on the aquatic systems.
Yes.
You have the floor.
Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to talk a little bit about the effect of pesticide on streams. To just give you a short impression on my person, I'm working together with my group on this topic since 2 decades, and not only in Germany, as you can hear from my accent, but also in France, Finland, Denmark, and out of Europe. As we all know, we need food production, and we know that food production, including pesticides, is more efficient. But on the other hand, next slide please, we also need drinking water. We want to have biodiversity and recreation. And these goals are a little bit opposite to the first goal. So what we have is the registration process of pesticides. And if we go a little bit closer to what is happening on the ground, we see that pesticides are applied, not so fast you are. Oh, that.
Some pressure.
Perfect. So pesticides are applied, especially insecticides are getting, when there is strong rainfall events, into the streams. The strong rainfall events produce erosion everywhere, and then you have the pesticide in the streams. So now, what are the effects of these pesticides in the field, and knowing that there should be no effects because the registration is telling us that there should be no unacceptable side effects. But we see that in the streams which have an agricultural catchment area, we have a change in community. So we are getting rid of insects, which is not so surprising using insecticides. And we have a much higher number of other species, in this case like leeches. And if you quantify that and you see on the x-axis on the left side the uncontaminated streams, then you have roughly 40% of sensitive species in these uncontaminated streams. And going on the x-axis to the right side, you see with increasing toxicity of pesticides in the streams, you are losing all the sensitive species until nearly nobody is there anymore. We do not only have a reduction of sensitive species, we also have a reduction in biodiversity. So again, x-axis, you can see the toxicity. To the right, it's getting more. And you see the species richness, and with increasing toxicity, we have a decreasing species richness, biodiversity. We also have a reduced self-purification. You know, nobody wants to drink the water which is coming out of a treatment plant, a wastewater treatment plant. So we are heavily relying on self-purification of the water which is coming out of these treatment plants. And if you have a reduced biodiversity of species inside of the streams, you have also a reduced self-purification, which is shown in this figure there. And in the next slide, you can see, as I mentioned already, we do not see that only in one spot of this world. We see that everywhere. This list is not complete. Okay. As I mentioned already, registration should not allow these kind of effects. We see these kind of effects, but it is clearly written that we should not have these effects. So obviously the registration process is failing. And I would like to give you some ideas why the registration process is failing. If you look at the concentrations in this triangle, it's a logarithmic scale. So as ecotoxicologists, we are living in a logarithmic universe. That is something which other people still have to get used to. But this means that for us, roughly spoken, it means that a 10 times increase of a concentration, for example, only gives a doubling of effect. That is a logarithmic universe. So now you have a logarithmic scale of safe concentration down there, and you can see that the registration process, that is a long arrow, normally is giving a safe concentration of a tens to 100. That is 10 power minus 1, 10 power minus 2, a tens to 100 of the acute LC50 of test organisms. So that is considered to be safe generally in the registration process. But if you look in effects in the environment, you can see that 2 orders of magnitude below, there is already effects. Now you could think researchers are making a mistake, or you could think that registration is making a mistake. This is a very big difference, because if we go to toxicants which we know, like alcohol, for example, everybody knows, not only the ecotoxicologists, then you see that we have effects in the environment at an equivalent of 1 little glass of strong alcohol, but registration process is allowing 100. So you can drink 100 of these. Big difference. And I will give you another short example to explain you why this difference is there. And I'm trying to go from the normal experience we have. If you are sitting in a chair in front of a television and you drink one little glass of alcohol, there will be no effect. And that is what is happening in the registration, where the organisms there are not sitting in a chair, they are not looking television, but they are sitting in perfect conditions which are not stressful. If you have multiple requirements, and this requirement is, let's say you are speeding with 200 kilometers on a German Autobahn, you are only allowed to do that there. However, if you are speeding on a freeway and then you are drinking 1 bottle of alcohol, one glass, then you are having a multiple requirement. You have the toxicant and you have the driving, and then you are at risk of being affected mortally. And that is exactly what is happening in the field, because these organisms there are having to escape from predators, they have to cope with low food, with low oxygen, and so on and so on. And these requirements, these natural requirements, make it that they are more sensitive in the environment. And if we look at the bees, which we just got some information on, you have the same thing. The bees have to find back home. That is their requirement. They do not only have to survive, they have to find back home. And if they are then affected by a low toxicant concentration, this combined effect is making a synergism. That's how the ecotoxicologists or the toxicologists are calling it. And then you have an effect. So what do we have to do? To solve these problems, the first thing we have to do is we have to face reality, and our society is very good in trying to not face reality. If you look, for example, at the amount of pesticide toxicity which is released in the environment, then you see on this figure, over the last 20 years, roughly, that there is an increase, a strong increase in amount of toxicity. Now you would ask yourself, well, we often hear there is no increase of pesticide sales in the last 20 years. That's true. There is no substantial increase of pesticide sales. But the problem is the pesticides are getting more efficient. And if the pesticides are more toxic than the pesticides we did use 20 years ago, Lindane, for example, you had to put several liters on a hectare. With the pyrethroid, you only need to put a few gram or 100 gram on a hectare of a field. Then the amount of toxicity which is released in the environment is increasing, and you can see here for fungicides, herbicides, and insecticides, the amount of toxicity which is released in the environment by agriculture is strongly increasing. And now I would like to give you, you might have heard that there is a National Action Plan pesticide, which means that all the member states are trying to reduce or it is written even to further reduce the impact of pesticides on the environment and also on humans. They want to reduce the effect of pesticide by 30%. So if you look on the left graph, you see that this aim, because the reference period of the NAP, of the NAP, National Action Plan Pesticide, is written inside here in this left figure, that this aim has not really been reached. And to reach this aim, and now you have to come back to my little explanation of the logarithmic universe, if you want to reach this aim to reduce effect by 30%, you need to have a 90% reduction of pesticide toxicity. Because not only one pesticide is making one effect, but you have a dose-response relationship which is translating the pesticide concentration to the effect. And this end up with these kind of figures. And if you want so we see that we are far away from this aim. The second thing which we need if we want to face reality is that we look into reality, so that we are not only staying at our computers or at our labs or in our commissions. We should also sometimes go out and see what is actually happening, because all disasters in toxicology and in ecotoxicology were uncovered by monitoring. And this is with the DDT problem of the bald eagle. It was not predicted, it was monitored. This is with the neonicotinoids and the bees. It was not predicted, it was observed. And this is also with the pesticide effects which we have in streams. On the right side, the little picture should be dead invertebrates, difficult to see, but I promise I made this picture, I did see them. So we have to do more monitoring. We are doing a big monitoring project now in Germany, paid by the Umweltbundesamt, the German EPA, and our institution, which is a small stream monitoring project where we are trying to show also to the Bundesländer, to the regional authorities in Germany, what is actually happening in the field, and that they are going beyond to just have to listen to scientists, but also can investigate these kind of things themselves. And I would be very happy to install things like this, so actual monitoring of streams all over Europe, not only in Germany. So what do we else could do? Of course, we have to reduce pesticide exposure. You remember quite a bit. So how can we do that? We can use buffer strips, for example. On the right side, no buffer strip. On the left side, there is a buffer strip. We can introduce pesticide tax so that we are using less pesticides and that the farmers have some kind of incentive to not use pesticides. And of course, we can increase organic farming, which is one of the EU aims. Thank you very much.
Thanks again. And we proceed with Professor Zahler from the BOKU in Vienna. I do not know what BOKU stands for, but you will explain it. And you are an expert, and you work on the effects of pesticides, mainly on earthworms, amphibia. So we hope to learn quite a lot from you.
Thanks very much. Thanks also for the invitation to give my speech here and inform you about our research. Although I'm having trouble sitting still here, usually I'm used to walking around in the lecture hall. But I try my best. BOKU stands for Universität für Bodenkultur. The English name is University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna. I think you have to go to the presentation mode.
F5.
It's a PDF, yeah, but still it should work. There's a presentation mode for PDFs.
It's more on the right, I think.
Yeah, I'm an Apple person. I'm not used to Microsoft things. Yeah. Sorry.
Full screen view.
But maybe I can just continue talking. Yeah. This is just a slide to give you a short overview of my background. I come originally from climate change research, worked on elevated CO2, ultraviolet B radiation and warming, and their effects on ecosystem processes. And then I switched to agroecology, weed control, tillage, and since 5-6 years, I'm mainly working on non-target effects of pesticides. And so far we tackled with herbicide effects, insecticide effects, fungicides, molluscicides, and so on. And Hans asked me to give a short overview of our research and then also to highlight some research gaps we have so far. So what is special with our approach? We try to mimic the nature as close as possible in our experimental settings, in the greenhouse and in the field. We use field soil in our experiments. This might sound just ridiculous to you, but it's not common to. Usually, people use sterilized soil to do their experiments, and then we test species actually living in agricultural fields. This is also not common. The most common species used for testing pesticides are lab individuals, which are often, very often, especially with terrestrial invertebrates, not living in agricultural fields at all. So there's some mismatch here. Organisms we studied so far are earthworms, springtails, mycorrhizal fungi, and so on. You will see some of them later. And we focus our experiments on formulations, commercial formulations the farmers use actually in the fields, rather than only testing active ingredients, which most of the tests are focusing on, also the registration tests. So let's jump right into our experiments on soil biota. So we did greenhouse and field studies to test effects of herbicides, mainly glyphosate-based herbicides, so Roundup and other products. And as you can see in the pictures, we had some big, we call it mesocosms, like 50-liter pots, where we established weed communities, model weed communities. Most of the tests are working without weeds at all. They spray the toxics only on the soil surface, but not on the plants. And then we used a multi-species setting, so we added earthworms, springtails, and different other creatures to these pots, and then sprayed them with herbicides. So just as a background information, the official test guidelines from OECD, for instance, for earthworms are quite simple. There is, for instance, the earthworm acute toxicity test, which goes over 7 to 14 days only. It uses Eisenia foetida. This is the compost worm. And as the name already tells us, this is a worm species living in compost heaps, but not in agricultural fields. And we know from many studies that different species react differently to pesticides. And by chance, this is one of the species which is the most robust and most insensitive species we have among earthworms. So, but I don't know why they chose this species. And then there's the earthworm, back please. The earthworm reproduction test, it only goes over 4 weeks. And as you can see in the picture at the bottom, we have usually the OECD test tells you to use a small tray, put in soil, spray one half of the soil with a pesticide and the other half with the same amount of water, and then put in earthworms and then just record what the earthworm prefers, the site of the pesticide where the pesticide was applied or the site of where the water was applied. This is the official test. It's really extremely banal and simple, and we tried it out. It's just outrageous for an ecologist to do this. Okay, what we did, we had these big pots, and we monitored earthworm activity in these pots. And you know earthworms are usually living in the ground. You don't see them, you barely see them, but they have the advantage, they come to the surface to deposit their excrements there, and ecologists can count the excrements, count them, weigh them, and measure the ingredients in the excrements and get a measure of earthworm activity by doing this. What you can see here is on the y-axis the surface number of surface casts, and on the x-axis the weeks. And in the left half until the red stripe comes, this was the situation before the herbicide was applied. You see some oscillations in the earthworm activity. This is due to soil temperature, soil moisture oscillations. Some oscillations is going on, and then we applied the herbicide. And after application of herbicides, you can see one line is going down to almost zero. This was these were the pots where the herbicide was applied. So earthworm activity was ceased, almost going to zero after a couple of weeks. And in the other pots, the earthworm activity was still going on. So altogether, difference of 85%. And then we were interested in the reproduction of earthworms, how many babies they get. You can, on the right side, see these small lemon-shaped eggs of earthworms. 1 to 2 or even 3 little earthworms are in these eggs. And as you can see in the graph, in the red bars, there were about 55 to 60% less little earthworms hatching. These are the earthworms from the herbicide-treated pots in comparison to the pots without herbicides. So a huge effect also on earthworm reproduction. And then we looked at different aspects in this system, in our test system. We looked into microorganisms, actually mycorrhizae fungi. These are fungi which are closely associated with plant species. Around 80% of all plant species on Earth are associated with mycorrhizal fungi. And these fungi help the plants to get nutrients out of the soil. And they are associated with plant health, with fruit quality, stress tolerance of the plants, and so on and so on. So extremely important. And what we saw here was that with herbicide application, this mycorrhizal colonization of roots is reduced by almost 50%. And when we published this study, of course, we got heavily criticized, and people would say, okay, it's just a pot experiment, nothing to do with reality. And then we went into the field to look if we can find similar patterns, and the next slide will show you. This is a study out like a month ago, where we did this in a vineyard, and we tested here the 3 most commonly used herbicides in vineyards. As you can see in the pictures, these herbicides are used within the rows under the grapevine to keep the weeds down. And these are the 3 different products with different active ingredients: fluorosulfuron, glufosinate, and glyphosate. And on the left graph, you can see that all vineyard rows which have been treated with herbicides had reduced mycorrhization of the grapevines. And this is quite a dramatic effect, because there are studies out there that the mycorrhization is actually associated with the quality of wine and so on and so on. And we had huge troubles after publishing this study here. And on the right graph, we also looked into soil microorganisms, so bacteria, molds, yeast living in the soil, very important organisms, keeping the nutrient cycle running and so on. And you can see here not such a clear pattern, but you can see clear alterations based on herbicide applications. And this is a study accepted last week, so very new, not out yet, but in press officially. We here saw also in a field study in vineyards that when you use herbicides, you do something to the soil microorganisms. For instance, here we had 260% more bacteria in the soil. So the herbicides are obviously not killing the microorganisms in the soil, but favoring certain bacteria in the soil. But our knowledge is very, very fragmented and scarce to tell something what this will happen. But there is something going on in the soil. Okay, and then this is an aspect which is hardly addressed, astonishingly, but it's somehow clear. If you spray a field with herbicides, you kill the plants, of course. If the herbicides do their job, they should kill the plants. And then, of course, all the nutrients in the soil are unused because there are no plants who take up the nutrients. And what we found here is that we have, after herbicide application, about 1,600% more nitrate and 120% more phosphate in the soil solution. And of course, this is prone to leaching and also water erosion and soil erosion. Also goes into water bodies. Okay, this is another couple of experiments. I just would like to touch these. We also looked into seed dressings. So, many seeds are dressed with pesticides, insecticides, fungicides to keep the fungi and insecticides attacking the seeds out. And when we tested this, we could see, for instance, for springtails, here these small insect-like creatures, which are very abundant in healthy soils. And in a healthy soil, you can find about 100,000 of these springtails per square meter. They break up organic material and keep the nutrient cycling going. And what we found here is if you have pesticide-dressed seeds in the soil, you drive especially with fungicide seed dressings, you drive the springtails to the soil surface. So they don't like it in the neighborhood of these seed dressings. And then we were interested in some interactions and some cocktail effects. This is a huge wide area in research. But of course it's reality. And an average field gets sprayed with dozens of different pesticides, and nobody knows how they interact and what they are doing in these fields. And we wanted to mimic here a field which has been sown with dressed seeds. And then later in the season, the weeds growing in this field are getting sprayed with herbicides. So how do they interact? And here we have the situation without herbicide spraying for earthworms now. And then you can see where there's no seed dressing, there's the highest earthworm activity, and with pesticide seed dressings, we have a reduced earthworm activity. And then the next slide shows when herbicides are applied as well. You can see that the level of earthworm activity is generally lower with herbicides, so this corresponds well to our former results. And the effect of insecticides and fungicides are reversed. So we have a classical interaction of the two factors we are testing here. And then a short excursion in the aquatic ecosystem. If you picture this here, you have a pond in the foreground, and in the pond are living frogs and toads, for instance. And in the back you have agricultural fields where some pesticides are sprayed, and then you have a heavy rainfall, and the pesticides are, of course, washed into the ponds. And we wanted to see how the toads, European toads, are doing here, and set up a climate chamber experiment. We couldn't do this outside because we wouldn't get the permissions to do it outside, an experimental study outside. And we set up a climate chamber experiment where we had these trays with water coming from these ponds and added certain amounts of pesticides. And we also wanted to know if temperature is interacting with glyphosate, for instance. You remember I come from climate change, so I wanted to make this link here. And we had two different temperature levels, so quite simple in the setting here. And what we found is shown here. So we have here, we recorded deformations of tails of the tadpoles. And we have on the left side the situation with 15 degrees, and on the right side the situation under 20 degrees. And what you can see easily is, these different numbers on the x-axis are different concentrations of glyphosate in the chambers. And what you can see here, when you don't have glyphosate in the water, or when you have 20 degrees as a situation, we have no tail deformations, but we have tail deformations under 15 degrees with glyphosate in there. No dose effect reaction, but that's the fact. That's the pattern we found. And that's insofar interesting as the standard registration experiments are only conducted under standard temperature under 20 degrees. And it tells us nothing, really nothing what's going on in the field. And this is it's a very small experiment, but it highlights this huge gap of knowledge we are having here. Okay, we have ongoing studies now. We right now are testing commercial formulations versus active ingredients. We got the active ingredients, the pure active ingredients from the industry, and we are testing the effects. I can already tell preliminary results that the effects are huge, the differences are huge, so the formulations have different effects than the active ingredients. And we also test humus content, whether the humus content has an effect on pesticides. Okay. So why should we care? Of course, we know the soil biota provide ecosystem services from sustaining soil fertility until providing healthy crops. I'm rushing now because I got some signs. Huge gaps in our knowledge. We don't know anything about long-term effects, pesticide use in Natura 2000 areas, for instance, legacy effects on rotational crops, interactions with other stressors. I think this is distributed. And we don't know nothing about the pesticide input in our landscape. We have a diverse landscape and with different inputs, and how these interacts, we don't know. And then I think comes the thanks. Can you jump just over the... No. I also wanted to stress that we have a huge public upset against pesticides going on. I was recently in Basel, and there are every other month there are big marches there against Monsanto, against Syngenta, as you can see here, with 1,500 people attending. And I wrote a book about this, and only in German, but a very critical book where I highlight the main problems we are having. And then please jump over the thanks, because I have some provocative... Is there more? Yeah, even more. Next week we have a conference in Vienna about pesticides also. And because it fits well to the former speakers, the motto of integrated pest management is use as little as possible, but as much as necessary. The industry goes around with this motto. And then the next slide. I think there's no necessity of using herbicides at all, because organic farming is showing us that these mechanical methods, we have now, with the whole digitalization, autonomous weeding, robots crawling around 24/7 on the fields. So it's actually working. And the next slide. Yeah, we also have very lax regulations. If you see the pictures here, pesticide application in a vineyard in Austria, on the left top. On the left bottom, application of glyphosate in a vineyard with a garden hose. So absolutely no dosage can be fulfilled here, and also the private use of the pesticides with extremely lax and very hard to follow how to use manuals. And now please jump back to the thanks. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So we will provide all PowerPoint presentations to the public. I presume it will be published, and I looked to Nelly at our website. But if you want to get the PowerPoints in your mailbox, maybe you could write your mail address on a white paper and give it to Nelly. Nelly is over there. She's sitting on the floor because she's fueling her computer, I think. But so give your mail address to Nelly, and she will then send you the PowerPoints or the link to the PowerPoint presentations. We have now time for Q&A, for questions and answers. Are there any questions? Yes. You say who you are. If you represent an organization, you say which one, and you raise your question.
Hello, my name is Paul Thacker. I'm a journalist. I wanted to ask you, how is it possible that when we've been hearing repetitively about that glyphosate is only affecting the shikimate pathway, how could it possibly then be affecting the metamorphosis of these tadpoles? And then my other question is, have you seen any of these like counter studies popping up in various publications that we're seeing all the time when it comes to human health effects? Are you seeing some similar, every time a study comes out, there's another study comes out that says your study's wrong? Are you seeing that process work out in your research?
Three of you?
Obviously. Yeah. So far, I haven't seen a study opposing our results. They opposing us and criticizing us for using too high dosages in our pod studies. But we actually followed the manual, and the manual of these products is really very, very vague. So for glyphosate, for instance, you can either use 33 milliliters per square meter, or it says 1 liter is good for 800 plants. And because we have a pot experiment with a known amount of plants in there, we followed the second approach. And this is actually then ended up being higher than the official dosage farmers use in the field. Regarding your first question, well, the industry keeps telling us that the product is only influencing the physiology of plants, but obviously something else is going on. We have now experiments going on where we look deeper into the physiology also of earthworms, for instance, stress hormones and things like that, to get a better idea of the mechanisms, how it works. So far we mainly showed patterns, and now we want to dig deeper.
But you don't have any idea yet of mechanism of action. There's obviously some sort of off-target issues happening, but what exactly biochemical pathway is being affected, you don't know yet, right?
No. Actually, I'm also not really interested in it because why should I do research on this topic? I'm an ecologist. I just want to see what's going on in nature or in agricultural fields. And this, I think, will be the task of the producer, of the companies to show this, because these tests are quite tedious and costly. And I'm not really interested in providing research for the companies.
Thanks. Thank you. My name's Stuart Agnew. I'm an MEP. I'm also a farmer, and not exactly popular with the Green lobby in the Parliament. I give you the floor. Yeah, thank you. There was talk in the earlier presentation about the amount of pesticides being used, and I can promise you, as my experience of a farmer, that we are using a lot less active ingredient, a lot less. I mean, the examples. Or a lot less toxic. So glyphosate took over from paraquat, which I used a lot in my younger days, and that was pretty unpleasant. So it was a big step forward with the glyphosate, without a doubt. And the amounts we use vary with what the problem is. But another product we used to use called MCPA, that used to arrive in, well, we called it 25, huge containers. A large amount was applied. That's been replaced with what they call the sulfur urea materials, where you apply grams to the hectare. I mean, there has been a huge noticeable difference, and particularly with the potato blight sprays, where we used to apply great bags of powder used to arrive at the farm, and all that would be sprayed on the potatoes as many as 15 times a year, and that's now down to small amounts of liquid. So it really has changed. My chemical store just doesn't contain the volume of stuff it used to. Everybody is aware, and there have been for the last 30 years, that applying these pesticides, there will be knock-on effects, there will be side effects. And the industry tried to provide a solution with plant breeding, first of all with genetic modification, and now with genome editing. Neither of these things were mentioned here as an alternative to using pesticides. And why not? Why not? There is not the environmental damage associated with these things. I think you made a good point about bare soil. Applying, presumably meant a total weed killer rather than a selective one, because a selective one leaves the plants growing. But you're right, a total weed killer sprayed on and then nothing done is bad farming. Simple as that, and we shouldn't be doing it. The solution of mechanical weed control, there are problems with this. That machine you showed there, it's working on bare soil, relatively high speeds, disturbing the soil, making it prone to erosion. And of course that rake is knocking birds' eggs, it's knocking all the rest of it. There's no panacea. We need food, and there are going to be problems along the way. Thank you. Who replies? Please.
Yeah, perhaps I would like to answer to your first question. And if I got it right, you said in former times much more pesticides were applied than now the case. It's the case. That's very true, and that is what I said before. There are much more toxic substances which are used now, and if you look at the amount of pyrethroids, for example, common insecticide, which is used per hectare, it is in the range of 10 to 100 gram per hectare. And it is much, much more, orders of magnitude more, if you take all substances which are forbidden now, like parathion or like lindane. So I'm not surprised that you said in former times there were big bags coming, and now there are only small bags arriving on the field. So pesticides have gotten more toxic, but it is not the amount of pesticide which matters. Not at all. Not at all. The amount is irrelevant. It is the same than if you say, yesterday I drank a liter of beer and I felt happy, now I drank a liter of whiskey and I don't feel good. What's up with the alcohol? It is more toxic nowadays, the toxicants. So that is the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that it is not true that less pesticides are applied. We have the sales statistics, and the sales statistics of the last decades show that there is a constant amount of pesticides applied, of amount, active ingredient. And as they are more toxic, it ends up with a higher toxicity in the field. Now you ask as well, why do we not mention any alternatives which could be used? What I showed in my talk was mainly the situation, how it is now in the field. And the situation is that we have an increasing effect of toxicants on the aquatic systems. We heard other people showing it on the terrestrial systems and partly on the aquatic systems. So you just have to look and see what is happening. And then you see that there is a reduced amount of organisms in the environment. And we know it. We know it, for example, for the biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity. Everybody is telling there is a big loss of biodiversity. Of course, it's not all because of pesticides, but if we are looking to what the pesticides are doing, and we can distinguish the effect of pesticides in the aquatic area to other effects of stressors like nutrients, like reduced morphological quality, and so on and so on. But there we see that the pesticides have a very strong effect on the organisms in the aquatic environment.
Marta?
Yes, thank you. In complement to what was just said, the statistics from UK, which are very well documented, indicate that the volumes of pesticides used do not decrease. And even when seed coating with neonicotinoids was used, industry and farmers said, we will reduce the uses of pesticides, of insecticides in the UK. It never reduced. So saying that maybe on your farm you reduce the volumes, but in general in the UK over the last 10 or 20 years it did not reduce. And the second thing about using GM crops, it's a bit the same as pesticides, and this we can see it in the countries where they use GM crops. The pests are getting resistant to either the Bt toxin or the weeds are getting resistant to Roundup. So it's not a solution. The solution is to work with nature, to use alternative techniques. Maybe in some cases mechanical weeding is not the best solution. Maybe it's best to use cover crops. But using either GM or pesticides is the same thing for us.
And if I may complete to this answer, so in at least for the beekeeping point of view of any farmer not using GMs or MBTs, it's actually a big problem to use this as an alternative, because it is also another kind of contamination, which has a lot of market externalities for those that are not using that. So that's the reason why, in the practice, wherever this GM has been applied, we, in the beekeeping sector and for pollinators, we observe problems. So this didn't seem to be a solution. And then on the other point of view, it created on top the problem of marketing and contamination. And actually it creates a lot of negative consequences in everybody that is not using these GM crops. So for this reason, we don't consider this as a good alternative, let's say.
It's important to address farmers, and because those are the people dealing with these pesticides, farmers' questions. GMOs is covered already. I recall a study from the UK. It came out a couple of months ago, telling us that the number of pesticides increased 17-fold during the last 40 years in the UK. Also with potatoes, especially with potatoes. You had in the 70s like 5 pesticide products applied on potatoes. In 2015 you have about 30 products on average applied on potatoes. And the erosion argument that comes again and again, of course, but there are also studies showing that Roundup actually increases erosion because Roundup affects the formation of stable soil aggregates in the soil. So these fields may even be more prone to studies from vineyards on this.
Good. I take a last question, or maybe two, because you already asked it. So you and the gentleman over there. Michel, I won't take you because we have a private lunch afterwards, so you will have the time to speak with the experts afterwards. So you?
Well, thanks. I'm also an MEP. I'm from the EPP.
I know.
First of all, I want to thank you for this initiative. I think it's very important. Concerning the GMOs, and this is not a reply to our colleague over there. I'm not a farmer. I'm an ecologist, if I may say so. I'm a lawyer, but I'm really from a party that's an ecologist in Portugal, an ecologist party. And let me tell you that, GMOs has already been expressed here, and it's a plague. So let's not go through there. But in terms of glyphosate, which is what I'm so interested in, is that, let me tell you that lands are, and I'm not a scientist, so it's what it is. Lands are so saturated with pesticides, with you name it. In my country, the Portuguese, we have 20% of in our blood. We have more 20% than any other Europeans of glyphosates in our blood. So imagine what that represents to us. And why? Because we were not aware of what was being used. We were not explained. Perhaps you know there is this firm, Monsanto. They have been exploiting and over-exploiting our resources in Portugal, and it's a catastrophic situation. And now, thanks to, I don't know what, the municipalities are banning all glyphosates everywhere. So I hope that in the next few years, you don't need that. There are alternatives. And that was, no, it was not a question. It was more a statement. Independently of what group you belong to, you have to think of our health and the health of our citizens.
Perfect. Then a last question from the gentleman.
My name is Tony Trudale. I try to work with NGOs. I live here in Brussels. For the two lawyers from America, there's state cases and federal cases, and I'd be interested to know, amongst thousands of cases, what the interactions are. For example, with the Daubert standard, is that applied at all in the state courts? Are there synergies, or just in general?
Want me to take that? So the Daubert standard from the federal court system is a stricter analysis of the experts and is more inclined to be used as a gatekeeper to keep experts out. Some states have something comparable to the Daubert standard, but it's slightly laxer. And some states have, like Missouri until recently, had a standard where if the expert had a degree from a recognized university he was in. So it depends. California, where we've been litigating and where that trial just was, has what's called the Sargon standard, and it's similar to Daubert, but slightly easier. But we got through both.
Okay,
Does
then
that
we
answer your question?
Yes. Then we go to the second part of the hearing, the impacts on human health. Professor Kortenkamp, Angeliki, come to the stage. We start with Professor Kortenkamp. Yeah, no, stay with us. We go to... Yeah, of course. You're welcome. Professor Kortenkamp, I discovered your name, Professor, somewhere in 2011, 12, 13, when we discussed in the Parliament the follow-up of the pesticides regulation and the request of Parliament and the legislator to come with criteria on endocrine disruptors. You were working with the DG, the Directorate General Environment of that time in the European Commission. You are the author with many other colleagues of the so-called Kortenkamp reports on endocrine disruptors. We invited you here because we wanted to hear what is the state of play on endocrine disruptors. Do you see also a link with the present pesticides debate? And with a lot of pleasure, I give you the place to and the floor to explain what you are knowing.
Well, thank you very much for this nice introduction and the invitation to speak in front of you today. I've prepared a contribution about mixture effects and endocrine disruptors, but really I'd like to broaden out the perspective. We've heard a lot about single chemicals, but in my opinion that's the lesson from a lot of endocrine disruptor research and also research on mixtures. We need to take a much broader view. Next slide, please. Until fairly recently, the consensus of the risk assessment establishment was that risks from mixtures are minimal as long as chemical exposures stay below regulatory limits. Now, there are several problems with this statement. The main problem is that if you consider the universe of chemicals in current use, estimates vary, 30,000, 50,000, 80,000, there's only a tiny fraction of them for which we have regulatory values. So what about all the rest? But over the years, in a very interesting process that goes back 20 years when I was little and started to work on mixture effects about 20 years ago, and also mixtures of endocrine disruptors. Scientific evidence has accumulated that really calls into question this risk assessor consensus. Next one. Here's an experiment which we did with estrogenic endocrine disruptors. We applied concentrations of these chemicals, pesticides are among them, but many others, at levels that on their own, you see here numbered from 1 through to 8, did not produce any observable effects in our test system. Yet, when we put it together, you see the red bar to the right, that was the observed combined effect of all these chemicals together. We called it somewhat provocatively the something from nothing effect. The results here I show you are from an experiment with isolated cells, and vis-à-vis human mammalian toxicologists, you need to do animal experiments in order to acquire street credibility. Next one. Which we did here. This is an experiment with a couple of anti-androgenic pesticides, vinclozolin, flutamide, prosimidone, which we used to study their effect on the proper sexual development of males, of little male rats, after their mothers were exposed during pregnancy to these substances. So what you see here is the feminizing effect of this mixture. So to the very left, you have the effect in untreated male. in the middle, the 3 red bars show the 3 pesticides applied at a certain dose. Every statistician will tell you there's no real difference to the left bar, the control males. Yet, when we combine the 3 at the same dose, you see the following bars, the smaller one, we have a demasculinization, which is halfway between control males and control females, shown here on the very right. And this really was the one key study that caught the attention of regulators and in the risk assessment establishment, and they began to take this a little more seriously. Next one. Next slide. So the Water Framework Directive, the EU Water Framework Directive, specifies environmental quality standards for a set of 45 priority pollutants. And recent results from a study conducted by the European Commission Joint Research Centre has shown that when you mix these all chemicals at their environmental quality standards, there's actually no protection against mixture effects. Next. They were able to show that combinations of 14 to 19 pollutants applied at their environmental quality standards produce toxicity in algae, daphnia, and fish. So these kind of studies take this investigation of mixture effects a level further. They begin to ask questions, do we have sufficient protection at exposures equivalent to regulatory levels? Next one. A very recent study from Paris at the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle have shown that, you see, this takes it even a level further. They applied 15 chemicals at levels found in human amniotic fluid and applied it in their test system to tadpoles and were able to show that at these very levels there are alterations in thyroid hormone which compromise brain development in the tadpole. And one begins to wonder what this may mean for a real human developing baby. There are quite serious concerns. Next one. So it is, there are many more similar studies, but it is clear that the single chemical regulatory regime cannot capture these phenomena. You know the pesticides in particular, but also other chemicals are regulated one by one. The possibility of cocktail effects is totally ignored. Next. So this system systemically ignores mixture effects. And next. And the problem with this is there is no protection whatsoever from coincidental mixtures composed of pesticides, of food contaminants, of industrial chemicals, of food additives, whatever. And that is the problem. The progress in this sphere has been roughly as follows. Next. Already in 1987, the European Inland Fisheries and Agriculture Advisory Commission, on the basis of research conducted already then on mixtures, said that the setting of quality standards should focus on mixtures, not single chemicals. But nothing could happen at this time. This was the time before we had the Water Framework Directive. There was actually in Europe the legal framework for doing something serious about mixtures was not available at all. Then in 2005, in the European Regulation on Maximum Pesticide Residue Limits, that was a serious innovation. We had for the first time a legal mandate for considering cumulative and synergistic effects of pesticides during the setting of maximum residue limits. But since then, nothing much has happened. So since 2005, the European Food Safety Authority has been working on the issue, trying to solve it, with no tangible result to this very day. 2018. So, next. Why is there so slow progress with dealing with combination effects in chemical regulation in Europe, and not only Europe, also in the USA. The USA have a tradition of dealing with pesticide mixtures that is about 20 years longer than we have in Europe, and there's more expertise accumulated, but the regulatory system in the US omits ecotoxicological considerations, only a focus on human toxicology and human risks to our health. There's also in the US no focus on any other groups of chemicals. So why is the progress with this so slow? The conclusion clearly has to be that the science about dealing with this is ready. We have produced over the last 20 to 30 years plenty of evidence that actually something should happen. Why then so slow? Next one. It's to do with the fact that the European chemical regulatory system is organized in silos. So first you had 4 silos. Here you have a dysfunctional silo, and on the next one you see one that's collapsing. So we have a silo for pesticides, we have a silo for food contaminants, we have a silo for industrial chemicals, a silo for cosmetics, and so on. I could go on. And the chemical regulatory system in each of these silos has developed over a long time, totally independently of other silos. And mixture toxicology and the challenge of dealing with cocktail effects needs an integration across the silos, which is not easy to do. For example, the data requirements to do mixture risk assessments in the pesticide silo are comparatively good. In the other silos, we don't even, although the scientific methods are there, we haven't got the proper data to conduct a scientifically robust mixture risk assessment. So even there, on this level, there are many problems. So, next one. Here is one example. This is from a paper we published some time ago. In reality, of course, chemicals have the nasty habit of disobeying the artificial boundaries imposed by chemical regulatory silos. They congregate in our bodies regardless. So here's an example. The red bar, the first group down, shows you our exposure to brominated flame retardants. They theoretically, plus taken together with phthalates, they come from different regulatory silos. And then the series of bars towards the bottom follow some pesticides. So the message of this is we are, of course, exposed to a very large number of chemicals, each from different regulatory silos. Next one. So, next. Some of the silos in the EU regulatory system have a scope for dealing with mixtures. For example, the pesticides, food contaminants, and the Water Framework Directive. Even food contaminants is badly implemented. Not much is implemented, though. It's the legal mandate is written down, but in practice, really not much is implemented. Next. What is missing is a mandate for assessing mixtures across silos. For example, food contaminants combined with pesticides. That would be a very logical task, I would imagine, for the European Food Safety Authority. We eat food where we have heavy metals, there are food contaminants, they are regulated differently. Our foods are also contaminated with pesticide residues. But even sometimes when one speaks to EFSA officials and floats the idea, well, wouldn't it be good to examine the possible combined risks from food contaminants and pesticides together, one often gets hard stares or glances of total incomprehension. Why would this even be a question worth investigating? So a lot needs to be done. Next one. So a multi-chemical, multi-route assessment of lots of chemicals, pesticides, together with all sorts of other chemicals, is missing altogether. And if there's one lesson from the experience across the pond with the US-American regulatory system, if there is no legal mandate, nothing moves forward. Next one. So here, that's just a chart to summarize what I just said. Next one. Here we are with the bottleneck. Next. We have no legal mandates in a lot of relevant regulatory silos. And as I said, as long as those are not laid down, nothing moves forward. It's not an accident of history that the mixture risk assessment guidance of the US-American Environmental Protection Agency is so elaborate. That is because they already 20 years ago had a legal mandate to do so, but over the pond, without that legal mandate, nothing would have happened. So this is really essential, and that's why I'm so pleased to be able to speak in front of a grouping here in the European Parliament. Here is a task for you, parliamentarians. At the moment, the European Commission, I think, is constitutionally unable to push this issue forward, although they've done quite a lot to gather the scientific evidence. After all, a lot of the evidence I've shown you today comes from EU-funded, European Commission-funded research projects, but as is often the case, very much to our frustration as scientists, a lot of EU-funded research has very little impact on EU regulatory decisions. So, first task, fill up, put legal mandates in relevant silos where these are not there for mixture risk assessment. Next. And this is the biggest challenge for the entire system. We need a mandate for mixture risk assessment across silos. For example, in the style of the Water Framework Directive, that's a directive where that handles the emissions from all sorts of sectors in one environmental medium, our water, the water in our streams and the water we drink. Something similar, something equivalent to deal with the multiple exposure pathways that come together in our body is sorely missing and needs to be addressed at EU level. Next. With these thoughts, I'd like to thank you for your attention and look forward to some questions if you have any.
Thank you. I take the message of the legislator. Angeliki, Pesticides Action Network, you're the last one to speak today, and then we have the Q&A. What are your insights on pesticides and the impact on human health?
Thank you very much. I know I'm the last speaker, but I hope I can keep your attention for another 15 minutes, as I would like to present some cases we've seen beyond glyphosate, because glyphosate has been discussed a lot today, but also in the PEST committee. And I would like to bring your attention that this is not a one-off case. And this is happening also, such problems with the risk assessment of pesticides happens with other chemicals, and we end up having these potentially dangerous chemicals in the environment, in our food, and so on. Next. So, we know that we heard about endocrine disruptors. What is particularly interesting with pesticides and why we're really concerned is because these chemicals are designed to be toxic to living organisms. That means that they have the capacity to penetrate through biological membranes to reach the interior of the cells to exert an action. And often they interact with hormones. We have enough studies that they show that more than 200 or 300 pesticides, they interacted with specific proteins that they synthesize hormones, or the metabolism of other proteins or enzymes or molecules that are involved in the hormone metabolism. Unlike natural hormones that they are metabolized and then excreted from the body, pesticides sometimes stay in the body. They're actually persistent, so they exert this, they prolong this toxic action. Pesticides are chemicals that are designed to acutely eradicate pests, like in the short term. So most of the tests so far, they had been designed to look at this immediate toxic effect, acute toxic effect, and usually in adults to mimic the fact that farmers are the ones that are exposed the most to these chemicals. So we are today in a reality where regulatory testing has major gaps when we were trying to see the long-term effects of low doses of chemicals, the low doses that we are exposed to and our children are exposed to, for chemicals that have endocrine disrupting properties, chemicals that they can interfere with our neurological system or our immune system. Now, we already heard that we have the pesticide regulation there to provide a high level of protection for everyone. That means that pesticides should cause no harmful effects to humans, animals, the environment, or the ecosystem. It also calls to protect the vulnerable, pregnant women, newborn babies, to use all scientific literature, not just the one that is provided by the industry itself, to consider not just the active substances, but also the toxic effects of the whole product and formulations that we heard earlier, and also the food residues that consumers are exposed to consider the toxic effect, the mixtures effects that we heard before, and to apply the precautionary principle, saying that we don't really need to know all the details in order to ban a pesticide. If we have indications of the toxicity, we can ban it. So that's why it's calling specific classes of chemicals as hazards. For example, mutagens, carcinogens, toxic to reproduction, and endocrine disruptors, as well as persistent, bicumulative, and toxic, this stands for PBTs, as hazard. And if pesticides, active ingredients, or products are found to fulfill this criteria, they're recognized as hazard and they should be banned. Now, what I would like to focus today is I would like to show that the problem is not only that we're not testing mixtures of pesticides or with other chemicals, we're not testing the products so thoroughly, but even when we test the active ingredient and we find adverse effects, these pesticides are still authorized. I would like to focus on the endocrine disruptors because it's the field I have worked the most. And here just to remind you a little bit the history behind the regulation. When the regulation said pesticides should not be endocrine disruptors, we didn't have the criteria to identify what is an endocrine disruptor. So the deadline was in December 2013, and we had a first draft, a scientific draft, was prepared, but was blocked, mainly because there was a fear that too many pesticides will be banned, and therefore we will have a market profit loss that would be significant. At the end, we got a set of criteria in 2016. They're not yet into force, but we're going to have them at the end of this year. But all this time, in between, we have what is called interim criteria, which calls that if there are two classes, they say if a pesticide is a possibly carcinogen, that's category 2, and possibly toxic to reproduction, category 2, then it should not be authorized. Or the second class is if it's toxic to reproduction, category 2, or toxic to endocrine organs, again, it should not be authorized. The reality, though, we do a reality check, is that since 2009, 0 pesticides have been banned due to the interim criteria or due to the endocrine disrupting properties. And here I'm going to give you 4 examples where these pesticides, we have cases where pesticides, we know that they cause adverse effects, but they were still being approved to be used in the market. The first example is an example of a pesticide, is a herbicide, thiosulfuron-methyl, and it was approved by the rapporteur member state. The dossier, let me explain a little bit. So the applicant submits a dossier, and then one rapporteur member state does the revision of the dossier to see if it's admissible, if it has all the data requirements. So UK, in this case, it approved it, and then in the EFSA peer review, they found out that the second criterion of the interim criteria is fulfilled, because this chemical is toxic to reproduction, is actually toxic to kidneys, it creates a kidney failure, and is also promotes tumors in mammary glands. This is where women produce milk. Nevertheless, the pesticide, the Commission proposed its renewal in 2016, and this was positively approved by a majority of member states. Within the proposal, the Commission, of course, recognized that there were some data gaps or area of concerns, and then it said, okay, we approve this pesticide for the maximum possible time, which is 15 years. But we need to know the genotoxicity of metabolites, because this was not complete, mechanistic data and endocrine disruption, because we didn't have them, risk to aquatic organisms, because it wasn't in the dossier, and then the possible contamination of groundwater. We find this quite concerning. Now, if we look at the endocrine disruptors, here is another very common herbicide. Is known by the name 2,4-D. It was, again, in 2016, approved, first by the rapporteur member state Greece, although they knew there was an endocrine disruptor. We know that because we have several scientific studies that they show that there are effects on the testes, prostate, kidney, thyroid, and adrenal glands, but also their own industry studies, like the extended one-generation study, which is a life cycle study with mice, with rats in this case, it showed that it had some effects on thyroid. But the applicant, the industry, hadn't provided the whole data. So EFSA did a peer review and identified the data gaps and said that we cannot evaluate if it's an endocrine disruptor because we don't have the data. Nevertheless, the renewal of this pesticide was proposed for 15 years. Again, this is the maximum time that we can have a renewal in Europe, and it was approved by majority of member states. So it was given the green light. But together with the approval, the Commission asked for confirmatory data to be submitted after the approval. They haven't been submitted yet. On the existing information, not to repeat any other study, but the information that the industry hadn't given on thyroid, which is what the published literature had identified after exposure to this chemical. And of course, and it also asked for another study which is very sensitive to thyroid, which is the amphibia metamorphosis test, which we still haven't seen. Now, the third example, this time is an insecticide. It's a pyrethroid. We heard about this insecticide earlier. Again, the dossier was approved. The industry's dossier with the studies was approved by the rapporteur member state, Sweden. In this case, I have to say that they did ask to lower the exposure, the safety limits. However, this chemical is an endocrine disruptor with developmental toxicity. Their own industry studies indicated that it causes brain deformities in rats. And independent literature shows that this chemical shows sperm effects. So EFSA peer review identified these data gaps and said this is a critical areas of concern, and we cannot conclude that this is not an endocrine disruptor, and the toxicity of the metabolites, but nevertheless the insecticide was approved by the majority of member states in Europe. The Commission, with the approval, asked to do a systematic review and find out if these sperm effects are really endocrine or they're just casual sperm effects that a rat can have. And also to ask on the toxicity of metabolite. The only case here is that they did lower the exposure levels, the safety levels for not only for farmers but also for consumers, and they asked the member states to pay particular attention and apply some mitigation measures. Now, the last example I'm going to give you is one on chlorpyrifos. This is an insecticide. It's an organophosphate insecticide, which is still under evaluation. And we are very concerned because this pesticide is known to cause developmental neurotoxicity to infants and children. There are children that have been exposed since prenatal stage, and they have learning deficit. They have other. There's some cases where they say maybe autism or attention deficit disorder could be cause for this, but the learning difficulties is something that is certain. So it was approved by member states. Spain, actually Spain is the one that is using chlorpyrifos the most. I don't know if this is a coincidence. And the rapporteur member state, but he identified that the neuroendocrine toxicity has not been assessed, even if we have all this data from epidemiology studies on children. And the neurotoxicity study they had requested specifically for this chemical had not been provided. Yes, it hasn't been approved by member states yet. So the EFSA conclusion is still in progress. Now, we heard before that there are solutions. So in European Union, we have the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive that clearly says to use pesticides as the last resort. This is like a pyramid, but you have used all the other methods, and only if they have failed, only then you can use some chemicals or some biological pesticides. Unfortunately, the recent report shows that this Sustainable Use Directive is not implemented by pesticides. And what we also see is the mitigation measures that they are proposed to member states in order to minimize the impact of pesticides are also not implemented. And we have alternatives. Here is an alternative to herbicides. As you can see, the sheep on the right side. But in a study that was done was published in 2015, that they looked more than 1,000 cases of organic and conventional agriculture. They showed that if you apply just crop rotation, not other things, just crop rotation or using more than one variety, the gap between organic and conventional is only 8 to 9%. But then we see that other studies on, for example, agroecology, where they plant flowers to attract the natural pollinators and the natural predators, you can even have, in some cases, by increasing biodiversity, you can have an increase up to 30% in your yield in organic agriculture. So just to recapitulate, I just want to say that pesticides are indeed approved even when hazard criteria are met. The dose makes the poison does not apply long-term exposure, so new tests and approach is urgent. Independent literature is still given little weight. Even when we have effects, you see that regulators dismiss these findings. Market and profit indeed block the high level of protection for humans and the environment. And policies should be strict and clearly promote the development of alternative methods and their uptake by farmers. And finally, a different system for the production of our food is urgent. And with this final statement, I want to close. Thank you very much. You can find it here.
So time again for you. Q&A. Any questions? The journalist first, and then Axel.
Hi. So just to let you know, we're moving towards a ban in the States on chlorpyrifos, depending upon where this is. Like, there's just a response back from the court system. I wanted to get a sense from the two of you, because I have a sense, and maybe I'm wrong, and I don't know whether you might not understand the regulatory process in the United States, but it appears that it's much more environmental protective and human health protective, the structures of pesticide regulation here in Europe, than in the United States. Is that true? I'm just talking about in a very broad sense, because I understand, chemicals are regulated in the United States through, so many different laws. So I don't want you to dive down each little rabbit hole.
Well, on paper, there's one important difference between Europe, the EU, and the USA in regulating pesticides, and that is that in the EU, there's a legal mandate to also take into account ecotoxicological effects. So the protection goal extends to the little creepy crawlies in our environment in the field. So all this sounds very good, but as you've seen from Angelica's presentation, the flaws are always in application in practice, and especially the approval process driven by member states is absolutely messy. It's there's no stringent action on proper scientific evidence, and occasionally, as you have seen, the European Food Safety Authority has to step in and uphold a minimum of scientific rigor there. So I think in practice, in answer to your question, there's not a lot of difference between the US and Europe on that level. Would you disagree with that?
Yes, I cannot answer directly on this. I know that because I'm not very familiar with the implementation of the laws in the U.S. I know that we have a different system where we are supposedly have a hazard-based approach and you have a risk-based, but this, in practice, it's not so much different, I think. Maybe someone from the audience.
Axel, and then...
Yeah, maybe just as a small comment. Well, we just had the hearing of the OECD countries last week with the US, Australia and Canada, and they all very clearly advocated for the risk-based approach, and we know from other papers that they are strongly attacking the European hazard-based approach, which actually foresees that a substance which is carcinogenic, and that's why we have all the big fight over glyphosate, would not, in principle not be allowed. So I think, of course, it always comes down to implementation, but clearly on paper, the EU has a different approach, which is far stricter than that of the US. My question was to Andreas on the mixture effects. Because you wanted to give us, and I take that as a staffer to the Greens, as a mandate to make sure that we have mixture assessment in the law.
I can't give you a mandate. The mandate has to come from the people. Okay. I am not the people.
You requested us to look into this.
Yeah.
So, of course, that is, as you know, easier said than done, because there are thousands and thousands of substances out there, so one needs to find a framework on how to do that. One of the frameworks that is advocated is the so-called adverse outcome pathways, which I think is also one which is done especially by industry, which works on common mechanisms. I wanted to have your view on this approach and whether you are critical of it or positive, and what other approaches you would recommend to actually practically implement a mixture assessment across silos.
Maybe for the public, Axel is one of our advisors in the Pest Committee and in the Environmental Committee. And he was one of those very closely working on the pesticides regulation in 2009.
I think the adverse outcome pathway approach is an interesting scientific framework, but in my opinion not yet ready to be applied rigorously in risk assessment or in the political arena. And also, what I meant by the legal mandates is perhaps not as complicated as it might first seem. We do have a legal mandate for looking at mixtures in the pesticide legislation, both in the framework for dealing with maximum residue limits, but also in the framework of dealing with authorization, etc., etc. That is missing for food contaminants. There are similar directives and regulations. Nowhere does it say in any of those that mixture effects need to be taken into account. So my proposed action plan or a concept is not very difficult really, would be to proceed in a stepwise manner. First, identify the silos where actually we should look at mixtures, because in reality exposure is to mixtures, and that's the case in most of these silos. The food contaminant one would be my first recommendation, but also then look at food additives. And then secondly, once that's been implemented in each of the silos, we need to have a facility that enables us to catch up with the reality of chemical exposures, meaning exposure to chemicals from a multitude of different silos. So integrate everything. There are tools for that available, imperfectly implemented in the Water Framework Directive, which, in my opinion, needs a total revision, not a refit, but a revision. But we need a new legislative framework to enable us to deal holistically with combined exposures to humans, all these chemicals that end up in our body. I'd like to repeat, from a scientific point of view, concepts and methods and the evidence is there. My conclusion as a scientist working in this area, not only for endocrine disruptors but for all sorts of other effects, European citizens are currently not protected at all against the effect of coincidental mixtures that reach our bodies from all sorts of different sources and via all sorts of exposure pathways.
Thank you. I take your question and then our colleague.
Oui, merci beaucoup. En tout cas, Xavier Delouart de Inter-Environnement Wallonie, organisation wallonne de défense de l'environnement. Je voulais juste vous remercier parce que c'était vraiment très intéressant. On a appris énormément de choses. Et je tiens aussi à souligner les études qui ont été réalisées en Autriche dans des conditions naturelles. Et là, je me pose la question à l'EFSA. Comment se fait-il qu'ils autorisent des études qui sont totalement hors du champ naturel? Est-ce qu'il y a des agronomes, des biologistes, des écologues qui sont présents à l'EFSA pour donner un meilleur cadre au niveau des études? Puis je tenais aussi à vous signaler que dans le monde agricole, aujourd'hui, la situation elle est loin d'être facile. Et je tenais aussi à signaler que les gens qui sont les plus souvent présents dans les fermes aujourd'hui sont des vendeurs de semences, d'engrais et de pesticides. Et donc il y a une pression énorme avec derrière un enfumage complet donné par ces personnes. Et donc là aussi, il serait intéressant de voir ce qu'on peut proposer de différent pour éviter que les agriculteurs soient soumis à ces avis tout à fait biaisés. Merci en tout cas.
I might have been lost in translation a little bit. Can you...
Est-ce que vous pouvez récapituler votre question en une phrase?
Oui, en fait, la question, moi, c'est au niveau de l'EFSA, est-ce qu'il y aura moyen de réaliser une réforme de l'EFSA pour qu'il y ait des écologues, des agronomes, des biologistes pour donner un meilleur cadre scientifique, ce qui est loin d'être le cas aujourd'hui. Merci.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. Of course, we need to have experts. It was also mentioned in the other presentation from Martin Dermine that we need to have experts that are specialists in these panels, but not specialists in the production and testing of their own products like the industry is, but specialists on the effects of chemicals on the environment, on human, and so forth.
Okay, and then colleague, our green friend. You have the last question.
If the presentation that we have just heard had been presented to us 40 years ago, without question, no pesticides would ever have been brought to the market. I mean, all these great list of things that can go wrong. But we have been using them for 40 years, and you can say there are three categories of individual who've been exposed to these. The first, the majority, is the consumer of the food on which, when it was a crop, these materials were used. That's the main category. Then you've got another category of the people who actually used the neat material themselves, the sprayer operators. And then the third category are the sprayer operators who didn't wear gloves or masks. And I have to put my hand up that in my early days, in the early 1970s, I was pretty, cavalier about these things with gloves and masks. I was more concerned in getting the job done. So you've got the three categories of people who've been exposed to this at different levels for 40 years. What have we actually seen in the population? They're living longer. So is this really such a massive problem? While this has been going on, and since I've been an MEP, 30 people died in Germany because they ate organic bean sprouts. And yet we're often told that organic is the way forward. I don't know whether you include the following two pesticides in your tests. One is called rotenone, and the other is called copper hydroxide. They're both naturally occurring. They're both used by organic farmers. And in my opinion, they're quite dangerous. But have they been evaluated? Thank you.
Bobby.
If I can just make one response. And I think the assumption is that since we've been using Roundup for 40 years, wouldn't we have seen an impact in the population if it were really as bad as people think it is? During that period, we've seen an explosion in chronic disease in children. In 1986, we in the United States, the level of chronic disease was 12.8%. Today it's 54%. There are many other suspects. There are many other potential culprits. But the explosion in glyphosate use has increased coterminously with that explosion in chronic disease. You look at the affected populations, farmers in the United States are probably the biggest demographic in terms of the occurrence of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So we know that farmers are much more likely to get non-Hodgkin's lymphoma than any other demographic. We're also the other demographic that you're seeing an explosion of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is in children. But there are also other, we're seeing there are impacts that we don't understand. There are pathways that this compound, this molecule operates on that we don't understand. Nobody can explain why those tadpoles are not growing tails. But we know that glyphosate did that to them. But just saying that it's been around 40 years and we're not seeing an effect is not a good defense of it. And that it doesn't mean that glyphosate is the culprit, but something is the culprit, and you can narrow it down. In fact, Phil Landrigan, who's one of the leading epidemiologists and biostatisticians and physicians in the United States, has narrowed it down to 10 suspects, and one of those is glyphosate. But unfortunately, our regulatory agencies are not doing the kind of testing that they need to do to identify which one is causing it or which combination of chemicals are causing it. And that's because they're largely captured by the industries that they're supposed to regulate. So, I would just differ with you on the fact, I don't think you can say that we've been using it for 40 years and we haven't seen an effect. The other thing that you might consider is that 75% of the glyphosate that has been used in history has been used in the last 10 years. So and it's now in food, it's now on our food, and it's likely that to the extent that we're going to see effects, we're going to see more and more of them. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to add to this. First of all, your premise that life expectancy is increasing is not true anymore. I think there are signs that through austerity economic austerity measures, life expectancy is now beginning to decrease in certain areas of Europe. Secondly, your argument ignores totally, first of all, devastating ecotoxicological effects. We've seen a loss of biodiversity in many areas due to the use of pesticides and other factors. Secondly, although perhaps life expectancy has been increasing or is stable, although the trends are now under debate, what we need to look at are the shifting disease patterns in humans. There are many unanswered questions. We have, when I started off in this area 20 years ago, the projection was that 1 in 10 women would end her life with breast cancer. Now, this has risen to 1 in 6, 1 in 5, or even more. We're expecting an epidemic of testis cancer in South Europe, especially with many cancers, big cancers. We have increasing incidences. You might argue, okay, we've learned to treat them better, and that is true, but the increase in cancer incidence poses a really considerable burden on national health systems. Finally, my final argument. The regulatory system for pesticides, let us remind ourselves, in Europe is geared towards absolutely avoiding any effect in humans, right? These are inherently toxic chemicals that are designed to kill organisms that are used in close contact to our food. Therefore, we have a very strict and should have a very strict regulatory system in Europe. If you are now turning around this argument and say, oh, everything should be okay, why don't we see effects in humans? If we did, and I think there are signs that we do, we are speaking of a massive failure of this regulatory system. So that's the last point I wanted to make.
Right. We are coming to the end of this hearing. I think we got a massive input of information which will be useful for our further work in the PEST committee, for Maria Heubuch, Tom Waits, myself as co-rapporteur, and Michel Rivasi as coordinator of the Greens in the PEST committee. And I give the floor to Michel to make some concluding remarks. Michel.
Merci Bart. En tout cas, je voudrais remercier tous les intervenants parce que vos interventions dans les différents secteurs que je vais un peu plus détailler nous ont enrichis. Et vraiment merci parce que cette audition, c'est justement de voir les lacunes qu'il y avait dans les auditions officielles. Il nous manquait la voix d'experts dans des différents domaines. En tout cas, moi, je retiens une phrase qui est, je crois que c'est vous, M. Oberkampf, qui l'avez dit, Kortenkampf, c'est les citoyens ne sont pas protégés par les mélanges. Et j'en reviens pour répondre à mon collègue. Quand on regarde, moi je suis biologiste de formation, quand on regarde, il y a une épidémie de cancer en Europe. Que ce soit différents types de cancers, obésité, diabète, problèmes de comportement, problème de quotient intellectuel. Regardez, rien qu'en France, on a 3 millions de personnes qui ont des problèmes thyroïdiens. Et ce qui est incroyable, c'est qu'on ne cherche pas d'où ça vient. Et nous, on est des législateurs. Et donc, le rôle qu'on a en tant que législateur, c'est renforcer la réglementation pour l'évaluation des produits chimiques, dont les pesticides. C'est ça notre job. Donc, est-ce que c'est bien fait? On s'aperçoit par rapport à la justice qu'il y a des gens qui sont malades de l'utilisation, par exemple, du Roundup. Et puis, on s'aperçoit qu'il y a des failles dans le système. Les failles dans le système, on l'a vu, c'est que d'un côté, on a une agence européenne qui évalue les substances actives, et de l'autre côté, on a les produits qui sont utilisés par les agriculteurs, par les particuliers et qui sont évalués par des agences pas sur les mêmes critères que ce qu'on a fait sur les substances actives. Et en même temps, Monsieur Kortenkampf nous dit on n'étudie pas l'effet cocktail. Or, moi, ce qui me choque profondément, et quand j'interroge les agences nationales, c'est comment, quand vous analysez un produit, pourquoi vous ne faites pas toutes les études qui ont été faites pour la substance active? Pourquoi vous ne faites pas l'étude de l'ensemble du mélange? Pourquoi on apprend que Gilles Serralini nous dit ah mais il y a de l'arsenic qui n'a pas été pris en compte, ah mais il y a du POEA qui n'a pas été pris en compte. Donc ça veut dire que si le produit est 1000 fois plus toxique que la substance active, eh ben, on n'en rend pas compte. Et ça nous préoccupe parce que ça veut dire qu'on sous-estime l'effet des pesticides sur leur utilisation, vous voyez, au niveau de chaque État membre et donc de chaque citoyen européen. Après, il y a le mandat scientifique qu'on va demander à l'EFSA. Et en même temps, j'ai entendu, alors c'était une question que je voulais poser au PAN, quand on nous dit il faut que tout se fasse au niveau de l'agence européenne, notamment au niveau de l'EFSA, évaluation de la substance active et des produits. Oui, mais alors il va falloir bétonner, il va falloir éliminer les conflits d'intérêts, il va falloir qu'il y ait les ONG qui rentrent aussi dans l'évaluation. Parce que quelle garantie? Moi je suis une spécialiste de l'Agence européenne des médicaments. Si on crée une énorme usine à gaz, qu'est-ce qui fait que des fois on peut avoir accès aux choses? C'est qu'on a des agences nationales qui sont un peu des contre-pouvoirs. C'est qu'on a des universitaires qui sont aussi des contre-pouvoirs. Si on met tous les pouvoirs dans un simple, vous voyez, il faut vraiment réfléchir à l'organigramme. Et puis, ce que j'ai beaucoup aimé aussi, qui n'a pas du tout été discuté dans les auditions, je dirais, officielles de la commission PEST, c'est quand même tous les aspects de la biodiversité. Enfin, on va utiliser des pesticides, les agriculteurs même nous disent c'est plus vert en utilisant les glyphosates parce qu'on utilise moins de fioul, mais on est en train de tout tuer. Les écosystèmes aquatiques, les écosystèmes dans le sol, et en plus les agriculteurs qui l'utilisent. Donc vraiment, il faut avoir une vision beaucoup plus large et que nous, en fonction de tout ça, dans les recommandations, parce que ce qu'on voudrait avec tous les députés, et vous voyez, il y a eu plusieurs députés de différents groupes politiques, ce qui est très important, il va falloir quand même que nos recommandations servent à l'intérêt européen de la santé des citoyens. Pas seulement d'ailleurs de la santé des citoyens, mais aussi de la santé de la planète. Parce que ce n'est pas qu'un problème européen, c'est un problème mondial, l'histoire du glyphosate. Et il faut que chacun reste à sa place, que les industriels produisent des choses très bien, mais nous, par notre côté législateur, on doit avoir des agences dont on a confiance, qui fassent correctement le boulot et que ce ne soit pas l'argent qui achète l'expertise scientifique. Très important, et ça, c'est une des conclusions des juristes sur les Monsanto Papers. Voilà. En tout cas, merci de votre participation et j'espère qu'on va produire un rapport qui va faire un peu un bing-bang sur l'évaluation, justement, des substances chimiques. Merci.
Merci, Michel. I have to thank all the speakers. I think your contributions were of extremely high value for us, so thanks. A word of thanks also for the interpreters who helped us to overcome the barriers of languages. And I want to also say a special thank to one of my assistants, Hans Verboven. He's not in the room now, but he was the architect of this hearing, inviting all the people. And it took 2 weeks of his holidays, so I think I owe him some holidays after the elections. Thank you.